So as we first move into our slides, the first thing we want to think about is like, what really is Section 504? To start, it is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it prohibits discrimination based on disability. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a broad civil rights law. And again, it prohibits any kind of discrimination based on disability. We know that IDEA is different than Section 504 in that it provides special education to students with disabilities, whereas Section 504, it prohibits discrimination and it levels the playing field for students. That image, any of you all who've attended our trainings, and just any longtime educators, I'm sure you've seen this image before. I remember seeing this when I was in the classroom myself. This is a good example of what Section 504 hopes to achieve with leveling the playing field for individuals with disabilities. As we view that image on the left, we see that everyone has that same crate there that they're using to try to look over the fence and view the game on the other side. As we look at the right, the image on the right, here, we see that those crates have been distributed a little bit differently. Everyone has specifically what they need, and it allows all three of those individuals access to see over the fence and to actually view the game on the other side. Again, we want to remember that Section 504 is a civil rights law, and it not only applies to students with disabilities who may have Section 504 plans, students who may have IEPs under IDEA, but it also covers individuals who have disabilities, but they don't have any type of um, plan in place that would account for their disability or provide some kind of accommodations or supports for that disability. And then also students who may have health plans are covered by the civil rights protections of Section 504. So as we're talking about these civil rights protections and what it means to ensure that students are not being subjected to any form of discrimination, remember that all students with disabilities, whether they have a Section 504 plan or an IEP, some other type of health plan, or no plan at all, if they are considered an individual with a disability, they're all protected from discrimination based on their disability. And then, as we're thinking about Section 504, it's important to know who must comply with the requirements of Section 504. So, Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability by any school that receives federal financial assistance. So, that's going to be all of our K 12 public schools and any additional entity, any vendor of those schools that is receiving federal financial assistance to provide supports to those students. This also includes the Tennessee Department of Education as well. So we're all working to ensure that students with disabilities who are protected under Section 504 are not being subjected to any form of discrimination. We are going to get into a full set of slides comparing IDEA to Section 504. But kind of as a preview, some things to really remember here is that IDEA requires a student have a qualifying disability listed in IDEA. Um, or in our state board rules. And as we're thinking about those qualifying disabilities, we know that we have 14 categories in listed in IDEA, and then two additional categories listed in our state board rules as well. And those are going to be the requirements for determining when those students need special education and related services. And April's going to talk more about that in some upcoming slides. Remember also, IDEA is an entitlement law that is designed to serve a special population of students, whereas Section 504, it's a broad civil rights law, and it protects qualified individuals with disabilities regardless of whether or not the student needs special education. So you're going to have instances where students are going to have a Section 504 plan to support their needs. But you will again have those instances where a student doesn't have their plan in place, but they're still protected under Section 504. So here's an image to kind of help you really conceptualize what that means. And any folks who've attended this training, you're probably very familiar with this image here because we share it each time that we present this material. So this outside darker blue circle, this represents all of our students that we serve in our schools. As we make it to these inner circles, here where we're thinking about students with disabilities. So this lighter blue circle, this is a student who is eligible for Section 504 protections. So this is a student who is protected from discrimination based on disabilities. And then here within that circle, we have our students who are receiving special education services under IDEA. So those students are included. And again, remember all students with disabilities, whether they have an IEP, a 504 plan, an individual health plan, or if they don't have a plan at all. If they're an individual with a disability, then they are protected under Section 504 from any discrimination. So let's talk a little bit more about who is actually covered. What does it mean to be a student with a disability? So, a student with a disability is going to be a student who falls in one of these three categories listed here. So, the student is going to either have a physical or mental impairment, and we'll talk in detail about what that means in upcoming slides. The student may have a record of such an impairment, meaning that that student may have had documentation noting that they were a student with a disability because of a past evaluation or because of a medical diagnosis. But maybe that disability is now no longer affecting that student as well. So that would be an example of a student with a record of an impairment, or it could even be an instance where a student has maybe um, been an individual who was misdiagnosed at some point through an evaluation process as well, but they still have that record of having a disability. So they're still covered by Section 504's um, prohibitions against discrimination. And then we have this last category, which is a student regarded as having such an impairment. And we get lots of questions about regarded as having such an impairment. So I'll try to walk through some examples here. So when we're thinking about a student who is regarded as having such an impairment, here we may have an individual who doesn't have any documented or recorded physical or mental impairment. But maybe there is maybe a rumor that this student is a student with some form of disability. Maybe other peers in the school treat this student as though they may be a student with a disability. That would be a case where a student may be regarded as having an impairment. Or there could even be an instance where maybe a student is receiving some particular supports or accommodations in the classroom by a teacher, and it's not necessarily a part of their RTI process or a part of any other types of school based supports that the student is receiving, but they're receiving these accommodations because maybe the teacher has some concerns about a potential physical or mental impairment for this student, but this student has yet to be evaluated, has yet to even have received any kind of request for an evaluation as well. So this wouldn't even be a student who's suspected of having a disability, but they are just treated as such. So that would be those two examples are kind of noting what it would mean to be regarded as having such an impairment. And I know that's a tricky one, so if you all have any questions, please let us know. We can definitely either follow up or try to address them during our training. One more thing to note about this definition for a student with a disability is that in order for the student to be covered by Section 504, that student must be the age in which students with disabilities would usually receive educational services required by law and attend school. So here we're thinking about our compulsory attendance standards. So it would have to be a student who is required to attend school or would be in that usual age of where they're attending school. So sometimes our students who are a little bit younger than the age of 5, our 3-year-olds, our 4-year-olds, who would usually be in a school program at that age, if they're a student with a disability, maybe receiving some kind of supports, they're going to be covered by Section 504 as well. So the next question that we usually get after we're talking about students with disabilities and who falls in these particular categories to qualify as being covered under Section 504 is Who gets a 504 plan? As I mentioned, we have these 3 different qualifying groups of, what would, make a student or what would identify a student as a student with a disability, but only a particular sector of those students are going to get a Section 504 plan. And when we talk about a Section 504 plan, that's going to be a written document developed by a team or a review committee that states the nature of the impairment, the specific accommodations that are going to be provided to the student, and any related support services that will be provided to the student as well. And for a student to actually receive a Section 504 plan, that student must have a physical or mental impairment. So we're looking at that particular prong of the definition. And that impairment must substantially limit one or more major life activity. That is going to be a determination made by the review committee or the team. And that's a determination made on a case by case basis. That's made through your evaluation process. We'll talk more about how to conduct those evaluations and make those determinations. But remember, for a student to actually have a 504 plan, that student has to have that physical or mental impairment, and it must substantially limit one or more major life activity. All students with IEPs are going to fall into this criteria. They're going to meet this definition, and they're therefore protected by Section 504. But remember, even our students who don't get a Section 504 plan, even our students who don't have 504 plans, they are going to still be covered by the um, anti discrimination provisions of Section 504 if they are considered a student with a disability or regarded as having a disability or with a record of having such a disability as well. So, with that, we're going to move into our first scenario for the group. To respond to these scenarios, we're going to ask that you add your response to the chat. As I said, we have lots of folks on the call today, but the chat is available for you all to use. So we will look to the chat to kind of get a gauge of what the responses are. And I'm going to give you guys some think time here with this question at first, and then I'll kind of give a recap of what is happening in this scenario. So here we have Mr. James, who is a fifth grade teacher, and he is the school's 504 coordinator. He receives a note from a parent who is requesting a 504 evaluation for her son who has ADHD. The parent has provided lots of documentation from her son's doctor outlining his diagnosis. The 504 coordinator, Mr. James, he convenes a 504 team, schedules a meeting to evaluate the student, considers all relevant data and makes a determination about whether or not the student needs a 504 plan. After a proper evaluation, the team determines that the student has ADHD but does not need specific accommodations or related support services from the school to meet his needs. As a result, the team does not create a Section 504 plan for the student. So, with that in mind, our question for you is: has the school violated Section 504 by not providing the student a 504 plan? Okay. And April, are we seeing some responses in the chat? I know we have a few others from the department on the call. I can call on as well if you're not able to view it. Any responses in the chat? Michael, Courtney, I know they're supporting us with tech today.
Looks like we're getting a lot of responses for answer C.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. And C is going to be our correct response here. So as we're thinking about this particular question, the response should be no, the student may be technically eligible, but the student's impairment does not create a current need for services, and therefore the student does not need a Section 504 plan in this instance. So here we have an explanation, and I want to share too that this particular example, it was actually pulled from some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. One of their Dear Colleague letters on guides for students with ADHD. And our explanation for this particular scenario notes that under Section 504, a student may have a qualifying disability and may be technically eligible for or technically eligible, noting that they have that disability, but they may not need any additional services or related aids provided by IDEA or Section 504. Remember, our standard here is that the disability must substantially limit one or more major life activity. We'll talk more about that in upcoming slides and what that means and how the law defines that term. But here we see that this particular student did not meet that particular qualifying factor. A student with ADHD who does not need a 504 plan is still a person with a disability, as we've noted in our previous slides. So still a person with a disability. We have that documentation from the medical professional noting that the student has that particular disability, and they're going to be protected by Section 504's general non-discrimination prohibitions. So again, remember, Section 504 is really broad. A lot of students are going to receive those protections from discriminatory practices under Section 504. But as it relates to who gets a 504 plan, we have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And we'll talk more about that on upcoming slides. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to April, and she'll talk about the differences between Section 504 and IDEA.
Thanks, Chandra. Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute earlier. Do you want to address some of the questions related to the content you just had now, or do you want to hold those to the end? What are your
I
thoughts?
can, and I'm sorry, I can't see the chat, so I didn't
It's
realize we
okay.
had
It's
questions.
okay. Let's go ahead and
Okay.
ask some of those. So a lot of them are asking about how they indicate if they are technically eligible in the system. And I know those are system level questions, and we can address those maybe at the end. But keep in mind, folks, even if your teams have never evaluated perhaps and they still have that qualifying disability, they could still be protected under the provisions of Section 504. So we will defer to your team's policies and procedures on if you do have their eligibility remain intact within the TM Pulse system and you just mark that they're technically eligible without a plan, or you say that they do not meet criteria, but again they still would have the provisions and protections under Section 504. Chandra, there was one question around pre-K students, if they qualified as potentially as a student with a 504 plan, if they were in a voluntary pre-K setting.
So I think it would depend on the particular setting, and if that question, and we're going to have our email addresses shared at the end of the slide deck. You guys will also get a copy of the slide deck as well. If you can follow up an email with that question with just some more specifics, I know that there are different types of programs that are available for students. Some that are hosted by public K-12 schools, and then some that are hosted by other entities. So if you can share more particulars about that, we can share some guidance on that subject.
Perfect. And there's one other question around trauma. The question I believe said, does trauma count as potentially, or history of or current trauma count as regarded as? I would, and Chandra, I'll speak first, but certainly chime in here. I would look at the symptomatology. Trauma is going to manifest in ways that could be covered under Section 504. So think if there is anxiety or depression that is manifesting from the trauma. I don't know if I could say trauma in and of itself would qualify as a disabling condition, but I think you need to consider how that trauma is manifesting for that student. Maybe it's manifesting through inattention. Maybe the student has some aggression, defiance that is being manifested from that trauma. So look at how it's presenting for that student, and then absolutely consider that as something that you would need to evaluate for and possibly serve under Section 504 plan. Chandra, any other thoughts there?
No additional thoughts there. I definitely defer to you, April, with the psychology background. But I will say though, and we'll talk about this in upcoming slides. Section 504 does not have like a specific list of disability categories like we do with IDEA. So there are definitely instances where you may have some particular disability that is unique in its form that could be a disability that would qualify a student for the non-discrimination prohibitions under Section 504 or even for a Section 504 plan as well.
Agreed. We have a lot of questions around medical diagnoses. I'm going to put a pin in those because we're going to get to those. We have that in our content coming up. So just hold tight around the medical diagnoses. And then one follow-up question Chandra said, so students who have a disability but are found not eligible are still protected under Section 504.
Yes. So as it relates to any of the non-discrimination prohibitions under Section 504. So as we're thinking about not, and we'll have some examples and talk about this a little bit more in our, not this section, but the next section of the content. So those students can be excluded from different activities because they are a student with a disability or they're a student regarded as or with a record of a disability. So they couldn't be excluded from maybe the Beta Club or the track team, right? Those students also couldn't be subjected to any form of harassment based on a disability. So if their peers are teasing them or bullying them because of their disability, then that could be something that the school is required to investigate under Section 504 or investigate for some form of bullying or harassment as it relates to their disability under Section 504. And we'll talk about that more in upcoming slides as well.
Perfect, Chandra. Yeah, somebody asked a follow-up question to that. So you're going to get there. Chandra is going to get there around what actually those protections are in just a moment. So hang tight. You guys are asking great questions, so keep them coming. I did just drop, we had a lot of questions around the Tassel link credit. Courtney Boykin, our staff attorney, has provided that link again. So it is in the chat. Make sure that that is completed if you do need Tassel credit for today's attendance. All right, now we're going to get into the differences with IDEA. I would say this is probably one of the number one questions I get is people will call and say, April, how do I know when to go, left with an IDEA evaluation? How do I need to know to go right with a 504 evaluation? We're going to talk pretty broadly around the differences between IDEA and Section 504, as well as some of the alignments. And then we're going to get into my biggest recommendation piece in terms of when you're making a decision around IDEA versus 504 evaluation, what that means and what decisions should be, or what evidence should be looked at when you're making those decisions. All right, Chandra. So as Chandra just mentioned, Section 504 is that broad civil rights law, whereas IDEA is that federally funded statute, right? We are actually receiving money from the federal government to provide that provision of services for our students who qualify under IDEA. The qualifying disabilities, we're going to get into those a little bit more on subsequent slides. But really, under Section 504, it is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So when we think about, as we're considering those referrals, many of you had said in the chat, I'm getting these outside doctors' diagnoses sent to me. You need to consider those, right? Because it can be any physical or mental impairment that could substantially limit one or more major life activities. Whereas under IDA, we have very clear eligibility criteria. We have 14 federal disability categories as well as 2 state recognized categories, those being gifted and functionally delayed. So those criteria are very set in terms of what the student has to exhibit, and then they have to exhibit that adverse educational impact. Many times I get phone calls from you guys out in the field saying, April, they have ADHD or they have dyslexia or they have anxiety, but there's no adverse educational impact. We have to be really cautious not to take the language from IDA because that's an IDA statute in terms of do they meet criteria and have an adverse educational impact. A student may have a qualifying disabling condition under Section 504, and they may not have an adverse educational impact as defined under IDA, but they still have a condition that is substantially limiting one or more major life activities that you will need to consider, which we're going to get to in a moment, okay? Thanks, Chandrea. So FAPE, we know under IDA, we talk a lot around FAPE, that free and appropriate public education. But we also have that same definition and language under Section 504 that's not often talked about. But this is where you really need to lean into some of this language when you're consulting with parents or advocates out in the field, saying that it's an automatic that students receive a Section 504 plan. Here's your diagnosis. It's an automatic. Nothing is ever automatic in the world of Section 504 or under IDEA. But what it does mean is that we're going to consider that information. And if they do qualify after our evaluation process, we're going to provide them an appropriate education that is comparable to non-disabled peers. Not better, not worse, comparable. So when we get into the meat of the evaluation discussion, you're going to hear me talk a lot about collecting information in comparison to typical non-disabled peers in the classroom for the purposes of your team to first say, do they meet criteria? Do they have a condition that substantially limits? And then to what extent does it substantially limit? And that's where it's critical to understand that our obligation under Section 504 is to provide something comparable, again, not better, not worse. I know often I joke about this with Chandrea, as parents will call us when they're frustrated and say, you know, I want my kid to be performing at the 99th percentile. And in order to do that, they need extended time. Well, I appreciate that you have lofty goals for your child, but that's not the intent behind Section 504. It is an education comparable. So when we think of that average range, right, from the 25th to the 75th percentile, that is average. So we are providing comparable, not better, not worse. Under IDA, appropriate does mean something a little bit different. We're going to ensure that the plan that we create is reasonably calculated in light of that child's unique circumstances, meaning that through that evaluation IEP process, we're going to set goals that are reasonable given the student's current state. So for a student who has a specific learning disability, maybe our goal by the end of the IEP cycle is that they're going to be on grade level in one or more areas of deficit. But for a student who has maybe a significant cognitive disability, we wouldn't have the same expectation. Our goals and what appropriate means for those students under IDA is going to be reflective of that current state. And capacity and capability of each of our students. Very much that I in IDA, that individualized decision-making process. Again, eligibility for services, we're going to talk a little bit more about this once we get to the section around evaluation and eligibility. But essentially the crux of this is that a student with a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits, we're going to talk a lot through the evaluation process of how do you determine, do they have a mental or physical impairment? And then how do you know if it substantially limits in just a few slides ahead. Thanks, Chandrea. Accessibility. There is not a lot of language within IDA around accessibility, but you're going to hear us say this a couple of times. Where there's any ambiguity on one side or the other, we're going to lean into, for this case, there is some ambiguity under IDA, but as Chandrea showed you, that little graphic where we start to step into those concentric circles where we see that a general education student, and if they qualify under Section 504, and then even further into that circle were the protections under IDEA. So a student who has the protections under IDEA are also afforded the same protections under Section 504. So where Section 504 calls out some accessibility features, which Chandra is going to talk about on some subsequent slides, students under IDEA are also provided those same protections. Reevaluations. So under IDA, many of you know that we are required to do at minimum every 3 years a reevaluation. Under Section 504, periodic reevaluations are required. I'm sure if I asked all of you on this call what you would define as periodically, you probably would give me a different answer. But where there is any vagueness or ambiguity, we're going to lean into IDA. So we do ask that you conduct reevaluations for your Section 504 students at least every 3 years. Our TM Pulse system will track that for you. It's going to remind you that you have a reevaluation coming up based on when the previous eligibility determination was made. Under Section 504 as well, a reevaluation is required prior to a significant change of placement. This is not a requirement under IDA, but let's talk through what that means. A significant change of placement could be when they're transitioning from elementary to middle to high, maybe high school to graduation. It could be if they are remanded for a disciplinary infraction to an alternative school. Any of those could qualify as a need to reevaluate the student and to ensure that the plan is appropriately identifying those areas of educational need. So transition services, again, many of you on this call know that under IDA at the age of 14, we start to include the students with disabilities into their transition planning. We want to ensure that we have a mechanism to get them from where they are currently to their post-secondary goals. And we have a plan that's written within the IEP. That is not required under Section 504, but I will say a lot of the questions we get are, should we start inviting the student to their 504 meetings? I'll always defer to your team and the parents' input as to when you start inviting a student to their Section 504 meetings. I think best practice would probably be around the age of 14, that they can start to come understand what the process is, learn how to self-advocate for themselves and for what they need in that educational setting. But it's not required to invite them. It's not required to have them attend, but certainly it would be considered best practice once they reach an age that's appropriate to start including them in those meetings. Independent educational evaluation. So again, under IDEA, parents are afforded an independent educational evaluation if they disagree with any evaluation that is conducted. So meaning that if I evaluate a student under IDEA, and I administer a cognitive achievement and adaptive measure, the parent disagrees with my results, they are entitled at public expense an IEE. So they can go out in the community, find, given a certain set of criteria or geographic limitation, they can go out and find an outside psychologist, psychiatrist who can evaluate their child, and that will be at no charge to the parent. Again, that's at every evaluation that is conducted by the LEA. That is not afforded to parents under Section 504. Chandrea will get into some of the dispute resolution options for parents under 504 on later slides, but an IE would not be one of those stated protections for parents or procedural safeguards for parents. Parental involvement, you're going to see some subsequent slides around this, but many of you know that they are required team members under IDEA. They must be included and provided what we define as meaningful participation throughout the process. That is not the same under Section 504. They are not required team members. They are encouraged team members. And so I hope that many of you will not go running back to your districts and say, well, that blonde lady at the state told me that we don't have to invite parents any longer to our meetings. Please continue to give parents opportunities to participate in the Section 504 process. I think it's always in your best interest, in your district's best interest, to maintain a collaborative relationship with parents. We'll talk in a couple slides further around when parents must be involved with Section 504 in terms of providing consent. But they are encouraged team members. So let's say you get to your reevaluation. You have made multiple attempts to engage the parent. You can either they are not responsive or they refuse to participate, then yes, your team can move forward with conducting potentially that annual review of the 504, or if you need to do a reevaluation. But you do need to document your attempts to engage the parent, and you can do that within the TM Pulse system under the parent contacts. But we would ensure and recommend that you are constantly trying to continue to pull the parent in to participate in this process to the greatest extent possible. And this is the final slide of this section that I want you to laminate it. I want you to stick it on your wall next to you. I want you to bring it to your student support team meetings because this is the main difference between when you know if you need a 504 or an IEP. And this is really going to be the discussions that I want you to have as you're getting to that student support team meeting is, does the child, or are they currently receiving anything that would resemble specially designed instruction? So IDEA essentially provides specially designed instruction, and the vehicle for that is the IEP, right? The IEP really is nothing around general education. It is what we're going to provide in terms of that specially designed instruction, accommodations, modifications, and supports that are going to provide the child access and ability to make progress in their general education setting. So as they define it under IDEA, specially designed instruction is adapting, right, as appropriate, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. So these are the questions I want you to ask your team during these pre-referral meetings to know, should we do an IDA evaluation? Should we do a 504 evaluation? Is teacher, talk to me about how you're having to deliver instruction in the classroom. Talk to me about the content. Are you having to modify it, right? Are you having to change the expectation for this student compared to any of your other students in your classroom? Are you having to do a high level of reteaching, or are you having to change the pace of that dramatically, right? And we're not just talking about those accommodations that we could provide through a 504 where we are giving extended time or offering to offer the content in different modalities. Maybe we're going to do it in a read aloud setting. Maybe we're going to give preferential seating. Maybe we're going to do some level of reteaching. That's all appropriate, right? But when we're starting to talk about adapting, right, changing the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to ensure that the child has access to that general education curriculum, now we're talking about an IDA evaluation, and we know we need to start with an IDA evaluation. Keep in mind, we have some districts in the state of Tennessee that's their policy. They start with an IDA evaluation, and if a child doesn't qualify, then the teams then move to consider if a 504 plan is appropriate. We're going to defer to your district policies and procedures on if you start with that, or your team has the discretion to choose if you start with an IDA or a 504 evaluation. But keep in mind that either way you go, you need to ensure that we're not unnecessarily delaying or denying. I'll kind of embed this quickly into this. I was consulting with the district just recently on this, and the team started with a 504 evaluation. They were about halfway through the 504 evaluation when the evaluators determined that this was really something that required specially designed instruction, and they needed to start the IDA evaluation. Well, the period between the referral to the consent for 504 to when they discovered that this was probably an IDA concern was quite substantial. And now they needed to bring the parent back in and sign another consent to start the IDA evaluation. As you can start to feel with me, the timeline and the space between when the original concern came to the LEA was starting to be substantial. It was going to be months and months in this holding pattern. That's where your pre-referral processes are imperative, folks. You have to understand the scope of the concerns on the front end versus you don't have a pre-referral meeting. Maybe you start with a 504 evaluation. And then the team say, oh, this is really something that is in line with an IDA evaluation. And now we're starting the timeline over again. That's where parents become frustrated with LEA. So make sure your pre-referral processes are embedding some of these questions I just alluded to know where should we start and why do we suspect that level of disability, either under 504 or under IDEA. I think I will pass it back over, I think, to Chandrea.
Okay, and April, do you want to answer some questions before we move into
We absolutely can do
this
that. I
next
will
section?
open the,
And I'll actually say this as well, because we've been going for about 45 minutes now. So I think we can answer this set of questions and then take a brief 10-minute break and then come back with the next set of content.
that would be great. Let me go back to the chat and see if I can go backwards. I did see a question from Laura and Chandrea. This may be more up your alley. It said some states have additional conditions that qualify a student for 504, correct? I don't know if we can speak to other states, perhaps. We would just, and I'll let you, actually, I'll stop talking, Chandrea, and let you answer that.
No, and I will say I'm not sure about what other conditions other states may have. If that's something that you're interested in, though, that is a question that you can share with us via email, and we can try to find some research on that particular question and share it out. I'm, off the top of my head, though, I'm not sure about other states having additional criteria or additional requirements for students to qualify. And I'll say too that Section 504 regulations are kind of silent on that issue about whether or not additional criteria could be added as well.
Perfect, thank you. Question around, did you just state that parent request for a free outside evaluation is not an obligation from the system of a 504 denial of a service plan? So parents are not entitled to a IEE, Julie, under Section 504. Again, if you are evaluating under IDEA, though, they are entitled to that if they disagree with the results, but they are not entitled to a free outside evaluation under Section 504. If the team evaluates and determines the child is not eligible, meaning that they will not have a service plan, Chandrea in just a moment will talk about what their dispute resolution options are within your district, but they are not entitled under Section 504 to that IE, that outside evaluation. Is it ever appropriate to start an IDA evaluation process and simultaneously complete a 504 process and find the student eligible very quickly in order to provide accommodations while the IDA evaluation is completed? And Chandrea, feel free. I'm gonna say maybe two things about this. One is the timelines are the same, okay? So if Section 504 says that you must complete the 504 evaluation within a reasonable time frame. Again, where there's vagueness or ambiguity, we lean into IDA. IDA says 60 calendar days. So technically under Section 504, you need to be completing your initial evaluations for students who are suspected within 60 calendar days. That is the same under IDA. So when I hear that something could happen faster, that tells me that maybe we need to beef up and ensure that your evaluation processes are what they need to be to truly understand if the child has a disabling condition that substantially limits. Now, I'm going to say that, and then I'm also going to say, I know there have been some very interesting cases that I've consulted on where a child enrolls in the district. Sometimes they're from out of the country, or they have never had access to any early intervention, where there are significant disabilities, and the teams have to consider how to best serve them immediately. In some of those cases, again, I will never advise you to not follow your internal policies and procedures. We don't need to change what we're doing, because when we start to change what we do for one, it raises questions what we do for all. So we still need to follow our internal policies and procedures, but I would just caution you about rushing through a process. And in some of those cases where you do have this outlier, this exception, where you're really concerned about the student's disability and what provisions and protections are being provided, we would just say consult with your local board attorney with how to provide any supports as the child is being evaluated. Chandra, any other thoughts there?
No, and I'll just agree with your last statement there, April. For these really like fact specific scenarios, you'll want to consult with your local board attorney. Ensure that you're speaking to or you've consulted and brought in your 504 coordinator at the district level as well, to ensure that what is being done in that evaluation process is going to be appropriate to actually just make a determination about whether or not the disability substantially limits one or more major life activity for the student, and understanding as well that with the evaluation process for Section 504, you should be taking into consideration lots of different documentation, lots of different measures as well, to really make a good determination about what the student's needs may be and if the student qualifies for that Section 504 plan. So kind of piggybacking off what April was saying earlier, but also understanding that these processes could look a little bit different as it relates to a student being evaluated under IDEA. There could be, a large battery of evaluation tools that you're going to use under IDEA, but ensuring that you're really meeting the needs of the particular student and making these determinations on a case by case basis.
Thank you, Chandra. So yes, just to echo another question said, am I hearing you correctly that a 504 is not put in place as a holding place until an IDA evaluation occurs? I would not recommend that process. One, it's a lot of work on your teams because we're still obtaining consent. We're still evaluating under Section 504 prior to determining, and we're going to talk more about what that evaluation consists of and why it needs to be robust. And so Section 504 should not serve as a placeholder as we're waiting to see if a student qualifies under IDEA. One, I think it's confusing to parents, but I also think it's a lot of work and heavy lifting on your districts. You need to work the process. If they're being evaluated under IDEA, start there. Right, start there, and you can certainly provide whatever general education interventions or supports you can provide to support that student. But again, if they qualify under IDA and you've already started this 504 process, they already qualified under 504, now you have to close that process out. And all of that still needs to be done in communication with the parents. So this could be a lot of duplicative meetings, a lot of paperwork for your teams to keep up with. It would not be my recommendation to do that. But again, we will defer to your district policies and procedures that if your local board attorney and your director of school says that's what you're going to do, then certainly follow whatever your district policies and procedures are.
So we're going to go ahead and move into a discussion about district's obligations under Section 504. I'm hoping that this will answer a lot of the questions that folks may have had about some of the procedural safeguards for parents under Section 504. And then also, what does it mean to ensure that students are protected from any form of discrimination based on their disability as well? So as we think about the obligations that school districts have to students with disabilities who are covered by Section 504, we have this list here that really outlines many of the particular obligations. The first is going to be to implement a Section 504 policy. We'll talk about that in an upcoming slide and kind of give some information about what a typical policy would include. Then provide procedural safeguards and a grievance process for parents to ensure that they have notice of those procedural safeguards and that they are aware of what their different grievance options are. Also, ensuring that students are protected from any form of discrimination or bullying or harassment because of their disabilities or because they are regarded as having a disability or they have a record of having a disability. Ensuring accessibility features, not just for our students who are covered by Section 504, but anyone who may be accessing facilities on a school's campus who may need additional supports for accessibility as well. Also, ensuring that students are able to participate in athletics and extracurricular activities in the same degree as their non disabled peers. Also, there are some child fine obligations under Section 504. School districts are required to find and notify students who are suspected of having disabilities. And then the refer and evaluate process, which April is going to talk to you guys about in great detail about what that process looks like. What does it look like to conduct an evaluation under Section 504? What are some things to consider? And also the reevaluation process as well. Ensuring that those students who are going to be determined to meet the qualifications to receive a Section 504 plan, that those students are provided FAPE, and ensuring that any supports for students are provided in their least restrictive environment as well. And April will discuss LRE in upcoming slides as well. So let's look at this first obligation, implementing a policy. Districts must implement non-discrimination policies and provide notice of these policies to students, to parents, to educators in their district, and anyone in their school community. With these policies, they are going to address any non-discrimination procedures or practices that are implemented by the district. And for most of our districts in the state of Tennessee, these policies are found within their policy manuals that are available on their district websites. And the policy number is usually somewhere around 1.802. I'm using this as an example here because our state special schools, which are our state-run schools, their Section 504 policies are found in that particular place. And then here's a quote from from the state special schools policies, which many of our district policies include as well. Just kind of that opening statement in the policy that the board of that particular school is committed to maintaining equitable employment and education practices, services and programs and activities that are accessible and usable by qualified individuals with disabilities. It's also important to remember that when these policies, there's the requirement that notice is made to parents or families as it relates to these policies. And this can be done not just through the policy manual available on a school district's website, but also through student handbooks or other means as well. So if there are any other methods that the school district has for notifying the community of their policies, those may meet this particular requirement as well. Now let's talk about the procedural safeguards that are available under Section 504. So within those districts' policies and procedures, the district must provide a system of procedural safeguards regarding identification, evaluation, and educational placement of students with disabilities. These procedural safeguards must provide notice of what the district's obligations are. They must allow for parents to review records of their students. They must also outline an impartial due process hearing process or procedures that are available in the district that parents are able to use to challenge any inquiries that they may have about the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of a student. With those with the due process hearings, parents may be represented by counsel in those due process hearings as well. We'll talk more about due process on the next slide, but it's important to know that parents can be represented by legal counsel in those hearings, but that's not a requirement. And then the procedural safeguards must also outline a review procedures as well that really share information about the Section 504 process. With these procedural safeguards, usually districts are sharing this information in an additional document in addition to their policies that are available in their policy manuals. So this is usually a document, and there's a version of this available in the TN Post platform, where districts are really outlining all of their specific obligations under Section 504, providing this information to parents whenever there is a request for an evaluation for a student to be evaluated under Section 504. and ensuring that parents are aware of all of their procedural protections here. With due process, as I said, that is one of the procedural safeguard requirements, and districts must establish a process that's going to allow parents to challenge any of those decisions based on one of those three things that we talked about. So anything related to identification of a student under Section 504, the evaluation processes that are used to identify the student, or the educational placement of that student. So, kind of limited here in what can be challenged in due process, but it's important to note that this is one of the grievance procedures that is available under Section 504 to parents if they have any concerns or if they are in disagreement with decisions that are made by the Section 504 team in any way. With due process, LEA should really have a process that's outlining the structure of these hearings. There needs to be timelines associated with the hearing process and procedures for selecting hearing officers as well. Remember that this is the responsibility of the LEA. So you want to ensure that you have good procedures and practices in place. So please consult with your district level Section 504 coordinators. They should be familiar with this process. I know we have lots of them on today's call as well. And consult with your board attorney to ensure that if there's a need for any updates to the internal procedures for your district, that those are outlined in a procedural document as well. One other thing to note with due process, I've talked a lot about how parents can take advantage of this particular grievance option, but it's also important to note that if an LEA suspects a student needs or is believed to need special instruction or related services, and a parent has not consented to a 504 evaluation, an LEA may use due process to override the parent's non-consent there as well. So that would be an option for districts if they are wanting to evaluate a student and the parent hasn't given their consent. Again, the parent still has the option to participate in that due process hearing. But remember, this is an option for districts as well. We get questions quite often about what is an LEA to do if a parent hasn't provided consent for a 504 evaluation, and due process would be the option there. Additional grievance procedures that are available under Section 504 are what we have listed here on this slide. So districts are required to establish grievance procedures to resolve any complaints under Section 504. That's usually known as like a Section 504 complaint process in your policies, or it may even be listed as grievance process. And with these grievance procedures, they should include reasonable timeframes for resolving these disputes, also an opportunity for the individual filing the complaint to present evidence, some kind of process for investigating and collecting that evidence as well, and notification of any findings that are determined at the conclusion of the investigation. The grievance procedure should also include an appeals process that allows a individual who's filed a complaint, whether it be a parent or anyone else who is filing a complaint with the district, that they're able to appeal those decisions that are made during that first investigation to a higher authority as well. The grievance procedures must ensure that complaints are resolved again in a prompt manner, and those decisions should be equitable decisions as well. So we want to be sure that we are making decisions on a case by case basis, but also comparing them to determinations that have been made before to ensure that there's equity across the determinations that are issued under the grievance process. So, how is discrimination actually defined under Section 504? This is an important question as we think about really those grievance processes, but also some of the things that were shared earlier about students who are covered by the Section 504 non-discrimination prohibitions. Discrimination occurs when a recipient of federal funds is going to either deny a individual with a disability the opportunity to participate in or benefit from an aid, benefit, or service offered by the LEA. So an example of this would be an LEA refusing to allow a student with a disability the opportunity to be on the honor roll. So that would be one example, right? Another example would be denying credit of a student whose absenteeism is related to their disability or their disabling condition. So say, for example, we have a student and that student has an IEP or they have a 504 that documents the need for the student maybe being absent because of medical appointments. If that student is being counted as excessively absent when there is documentation noting that those absences are related to the student's disabling condition, that could be seen as conduct that's discriminatory by the district as well. And then another example here would be expelling a student for behavior related to the student's disability and refusing to dispense medication to a student who has a disability. So those are all examples of what it may mean to deny a qualifying individual with a disability an opportunity to participate in or benefit from the aids, benefits, or services offered by the school. Discrimination could also look like affording a qualified individual or refusing to afford a qualified individual an opportunity to participate in a opportunity or I'm sorry, to participate in an aid or benefit or service that is not equal to that afforded to others. So say we have other students who are able to participate on a particular field trip, but we're excluding individuals with disabilities from being able to attend. That could be an example of some type of discriminatory practices there, or failing to provide aids, benefits, or services to qualified individuals that are as and providing those aids or services in a way that is as effective as is provided to non-disabled students. And in this instance, let's say that we have an instance where students are being provided some kind of different level of support. Maybe students are being provided some kind of reward through maybe a positive intervention program that the school is administering, and students who are non-disabled students are getting access to maybe participate in some particular reward system where they get to use tickets to purchase different types of treats at school, but students with disabilities are excluded from that process. So that would be another particular example of what discriminatory conduct could look like as it relates to that final bullet point there. Some other things as it relates to how discrimination is defined, and there are a couple of more slides here. Providing different or separate aids or services to disabled persons or any class of disabled persons, unless such action is necessary to provide aids, benefits, or services that are as effective as those provided to others. So here, as we're thinking about any instance where the services are different, but it's not a difference in services because it's meant to meet the needs of the particular individual's disabilities, that would be considered a discriminatory practice. Also, aids or perpetuates discrimination against a disabled person by providing significant assistance to an agency, organization, or a person that discriminates on the basis of a disability, or in providing any kind of aid or benefit or service to beneficiaries of the program activity. Here we're thinking about if there's a vendor who is working with the school district that is engaging in discriminatory practices, if there's some kind of school-sponsored activity that would allow for discriminatory practices based on a student's disability, if the school district is allowing this or endorsing this, that could be discrimination on the part of the school district, and that would be prohibited discriminatory conduct. And then another prong here of this definition of discrimination, denying a person with a disability an opportunity to participate as a member of a planning or advisory board strictly because of their disability. I think that one is kind of self-explanatory there. And here we're not just thinking about our students, but we're thinking about other individuals who may engage with our local school district as well. And then our final thoughts here as it relates to what would be defined as discriminatory conduct under Section 504, otherwise limiting the enjoyment of any right, privilege, or advantage or opportunity enjoyed by others receiving an aid, benefit, or service that kind of acts as a catch-all here. So in any other way that a school district would maybe create a situation where an individual with a disability is not able to enjoy rights or privileges or advantages that non-disabled peers would be able to access would be discriminatory in nature. And then as it relates, and we're going to talk about this in more detail on an upcoming slide, as it relates to determining the site or location of a facility, doing so in a way where it would deny access for individuals with disabilities. So if we're thinking about our buildings, if our buildings are not equipped to allow access for individuals with disabilities, or if there are locations where there is a plan to actually build a new facility or build some kind of new school or whatever the particular entity may be or structure may be that the school is needing, not accounting for individuals with disabilities in that process and not allowing for some kind of accessibility features for those individuals could be a discriminatory practice as well. Building on this, I want to talk about bullying and harassment as well, because as we think about all of those ways that we see that discrimination is defined under Section 504, bullying and harassment fits right into that particular or those particular sets of definitions that are provided under the regulations. As it relates to Section 504, any form of bullying because of a student's disability is going to be prohibited under these federal regulations. This could include abusive jokes, crude name calling, or threats of physical assault, and then other types of behavior as well. As it relates to bullying and harassment, in most cases, we're thinking about peers engaging in this type of conduct towards students with disabilities. But it's important to remember as well that all individuals in our school setting, our students and our staff, are prohibited from engaging in any kind of bullying or harassing conduct towards individuals with disabilities. It's also important to note that as we are thinking about any kind of bullying or harassment, it doesn't always have to be any kind of harassment focused on visible disabilities. It could also be bullying or harassment focused on non-visible disabilities. So think about instances where there may be name calling related to a student's academic abilities. That could be a form of bullying or harassment based on disability that may need to be addressed under Section 504. Also, it's important to note that when a child who receives special education or related aids and services is harassed on any basis, and that goes for our students with Section 504 plans as well as our students with IEPs, if they're harassed on any of these bases that we have listed here and even beyond, so weight, appearance, social economic status, if the school fails to remedy um, that particular harassment that the student is experiencing, then that could constitute a denial of faith. So here we're seeing that it would not just be a violation of Section 504 as it relates to the anti-discrimination provisions of this statute, but it could also mean that there is a denial of faith for that student under Section 504 or IDEA as well. Also, some important notes about bullying and harassment as it relates to policies. Your district's policies on Section 504, they may not explicitly address this particular issue, but districts are required by our state law to have an anti-bullying and harassment policy that is meant to address how schools should respond to this type of conduct. So any reports of bullying or harassment should be made to appropriate personnel in your schools, in your district, in accordance with that anti-bullying policy that your district has in place. And that policy is going to outline the process for investigating these claims and issuing any kind of findings related to them as well. That policy should also address things regarding retaliation, prohibitions against retaliation or making false statements. And it also addresses compliance reporting because that information is reported to the state each year as it relates to investigations and reports that are received. And speaking of retaliation, I want to talk about this a little bit more broadly because retaliation, it can come into play as it relates to bullying and harassment or any type of report of discriminatory conduct in a district. But it's important to note that this term retaliation, it is used very often when parents are, feeling as though there are some concerns related to how a school district is addressing reports that they've made regarding discriminatory practices. My team receives a lot of phone calls from parents as it relates to bullying, but also harassment under federal civil rights laws, not just Section 504, but also Title IX and Title VI. And retaliation is often a word that we hear when we are on those phone calls or even in emails that we may receive from parents as well. What's important to note is that Section 504 regulations, they incorporate the anti-retaliation provisions from Title VI. So that means that any type of conduct that would be deemed as possibly interfering with an investigation or conduct that is done because or that is discriminatory towards an individual and the purpose of that conduct is to retaliate in some form against an individual who's made a complaint, who is participating in an investigation, maybe as a witness, or an individual who is even accused of particular conduct. Those will be prohibitions or prohibited conduct under Section 504. And then also individuals who are just engaging in any of the grievance processes, whether it be the general complaint process, the process related to investigating bullying and harassment, or even due process. They also can file claims of retaliation if they believe that there is some form of retaliatory conduct because of them engaging in those grievance options. So because of them filing a complaint or because of them filing due process. Also, and I'm sorry I advanced too quickly. Also, as it relates to Section 504, retaliation is prohibited in securing any kind of assistance with compliance with the law as well. So if there is a request that is made for some kind of accommodation or some kind of request related to an accessibility accommodation, and there is possible retaliatory conduct happening because that request was made, that could be something that is prohibited under Section 504 as well and would be required to be addressed under your Section 504 policies and procedures. As April mentioned, in kind of addressing the comparison between Section 504 and IDEA, Section 504 is, again, that broad civil rights law that ensures equal access for students with disabilities. And we talked quite a bit about this in our training as we're looking at what it means or how discrimination is defined under Section 504. Under Section 504, school districts are required to provide equal access and equal opportunities to students with disabilities, meaning that students with disabilities should be able to access the same opportunities as their non-disabled peers. And that goes for all educational programs, all benefits, all services, all aids. Also, it's important to note that in April of 2024, the U.S. Attorney General signed the final rules for the title or final rules for updates to Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. And that those particular rules address things related to website and mobile application access for people with disabilities. So when we're thinking about access for individuals with disabilities, we're not just thinking about moving around our school buildings and accessing our buildings and moving throughout our day, but even in this virtual space that we all partake in as well, there must be equal access there as well. With those ADA regulations, those really influence what's required under Section 504. And with those particular regulations, I think the implementation timeline for those is January 2026. So look out for information related to changes there. Section 504 coordinators, it may be helpful for you all to gain some information. And I'm speaking about district level Section 504 coordinators, gain some information on this particular subject as it may lead to just some changes or transitions happening in your school district with different websites or online platforms that are being used by students or families or others in your community. With accessibility related to facilities, and I noted earlier that we would kind of touch on this, districts are required to ensure that students and others with disabilities, so not just our students, but anyone who's accessing our buildings, this includes parents, this includes visitors, that they are not denied access to programs or activities because of inaccessible facilities. This means that our academic buildings, our walkways, our restrooms, our athletic facilities, our parking spaces, in our parking lots should be accessible to individuals with disabilities. The requirement to ensure accessibility depends on the date of the building or when the building may have been altered. So when it was initially built or when it was altered. And I think that date is somewhere around June 4th, 1977. That would be the date that you would look to determine whether or not the building is required to fit particular accessibility standards moving forward beyond that date, or if standards that were previously in place prior to the June 4th, 1977 date are the standards that are required for those particular facilities. The Section 504 regulations go into great detail about these particular standards related to construction of facilities. So I definitely encourage you to look at the regulations, and we have the regulations noted here on the slide as well if you're interested in learning more about what those standards are. Any district facility for a person with disabilities must also be comparable to the facilities, services, and activities of their non-disabled peers in the district as well. So here we're thinking about maybe a restroom that is a restroom that allows for particular stalls for individuals with disabilities. They must have comparable facilities. We don't want facilities that are much further away from common areas or common spaces or where these other restroom facilities may be in our buildings. We don't want these facilities to be burdensome to individuals with disabilities as well. They must be comparable to those facilities that are provided to their non-disabled peers. And then as it relates to just ensuring accessibility for programming, remember that individuals with disabilities, our students with disabilities, must be provided equal opportunities to participate in any kind of extracurricular or non-academic activities offered by the school. This includes access to transportation, access to lunch and eating facilities such as cafeterias. Students must be allowed to participate in recess and physical education, clubs and other activities sponsored by the school, and also athletics. And this list goes on as we think about and I know we've used this as an example a couple of times today, any kind of honors programs that may be available with the school. Even if we're thinking about accessing CCTE courses as well. So students should be able to participate in all programming that is offered by the school or any extracurriculars that are offered as well. If there is a need, these activities may be addressed in a student's 504 plan as well. There is sometimes a need to address how these students are going to gain that equal access to the programming in their 504 plans or their IEPs as well. It can be addressed there as well. But ensure that if that is going to be considered in a student's Section 504 plan, that the team who is making determinations about that particular consideration, that they're really thinking about the student's needs on a case by case basis and what is needed for that particular student to access those programs, whether they be programs outside of school hours or even if it's some type of programming that's happening during the school day. And then one more slide here before we move into the evaluation process. I talked about districts having the requirement to, or having a child find requirement. So that requirement to find and notify every possible individual within their district with a disability. And this is a requirement that applies every year to each school district, and each district must identify students with disabilities within that district, so within that district's geographical bounds, and they must notify the parents or guardians of students with disabilities of their duties under Section 504. This particular notification can be done through many ways. It could be notification that is provided through some kind of newspaper, local newspaper in the area, radio ads as well. There are different means in which a school district can take to provide this notification to the community, but it must be done on an annual basis to ensure that students with disabilities who could qualify for protections under Section 504, to ensure that their parents have notice of those particular obligations that the school district has to provide appropriate supports to those students as needed. Okay, in April, we're going to transition into the next slides. Do you
Yeah.
want to pause for questions?
I will run some questions by you. There were a few questions around procedural safeguards I think you can tackle. Is there a way to customize the procedural safeguards for our district? So she asked, I would love to be able to include information about steps to be considered prior to due process. What are your thoughts on that, Chandra?
And I'll say, and I know there's a document that's available in Post, but as you all know as well, the TM Post platform is not a platform that's required for use for Section 504. So if districts have particular sets of procedural safeguards that they'd like to use that include more information about what are all of the protections under Section 504, what are parents' grievance options under Section 504, feel free to use the documents that your district has created and being sure to follow your district's policies and procedures on what information may need to be included in those procedural safeguards as well.
Do you recommend, Chandra, to have separate grievance procedures in addition to due process?
So Section 504 requires a separate grievance process. So in addition to due process, you must have another grievance option just to resolve general complaints under Section 504. And those could be complaints related to individuals not being able to access facilities or complaints related to discrimination based on a student's disability. Maybe a student is excluded from some kind of particular activity offered by the school. Or even if your district determines that your bullying process or your bullying reports, I'm sorry, will go through that particular grievance option in your district, bullying related to students with disabilities, the district must have that grievance process. Now, Section 504 is a little bit vague on how that grievance option should be outlined for districts, but there must be an inclusion of some kind of notice of timelines associated with that process, some kind of resolution of that process based on a possible investigation that is conducted by your district level 504 coordinator or designee who is charged with investigating and resolving those complaints, and then notification to the individual who's filed the complaint as well after the findings and the conclusion of the investigative process.
Perfect. We've gotten several questions around attendance, and then which we'll hit on in a moment. I want to.
Mhm.
We get a lot of questions around can an IEP or a 504 excuse absences. I know Chandrea and I were recently at a conference where this came up. Remember, our obligation under state and federal law are to educate students, right? And our 504 plans and IEPs are mechanisms to provide either access or that specially designed instruction to provide then access to general education. So we need to be very cautious about excusing absences through our 504 IEPs. Chandra is going to talk in the next few slides around 504 team decisions around abbreviated days or modified schedules. And your teams can absolutely make those determinations for students on a case-by-case basis. But we should not be just unilaterally excusing absences due to the child's disability. We need to figure out provisions and opportunities for the child to have access and to participate through the 504 IEP process. But again, we really want to caution you. We have heard this a lot from folks across the state, and our obligation is to educate students. And if they're not at school, we cannot educate. Chandra, any other thoughts there?
I'm just thinking, I know that was included in one of the examples as it relates to discriminatory practices, and just wanting to let everyone know that in regards to identifying that it's a possible form of discriminatory practices, that's really a case by case determination, looking to see was there an instance where, and I think with that particular example too, that we may have pulled that from, it could have been an issue where the student had not yet been identified as a student with a disability and had lots of medical appointments, and the school had never taken into consideration the need for evaluating that student under 504 as well. As April said, we'll talk in later slides about how Section 504 plans can maybe address a student's abbreviated schedule or modified schedule if needed, but those are really team-based decisions that really require some um, very close consideration about what's needed for that particular student and what's going to be most appropriate. As April said, our goal is to always ensure that students have access to the educational environment.
I think you answered this question with that, but somebody asked about incentives around if they, have 100% attendance and their school-based incentives, or they don't get to walk at graduation if they miss so much school. What are your thoughts on those, Chandrea?
And I know we get lots of questions on the legal team about those types of incentives. I think another form in which those questions come are related to like student or final exam exemption policies. And we always encourage districts to first consult your board attorney on this topic because you definitely need that input from your legal counsel on these particular issues, but also ensuring that you're evaluating each student on a case by case basis, right? While districts may have some of these policies in place, kind of, hoping to incentivize attendance by students, you want to ensure that these particular policies or practices are also not having a discriminatory impact on students with disabilities where that level of attendance is not something that those students can necessarily reach because of their particular disability or because of some kind of medical support that they're receiving outside of school. So consult your board attorney, make those assessments on a case-by-case basis there.
Right. I think the last one that I saw was around, can a student have a 504 and an IEP simultaneously? I think you and your team just helped me answer that with another district. The short answer is yes, but remember that graphic that Chandrea showed. An IEP really is a more narrow, intensive version of a 504 plan. So yes, you can provide, let's say there's a medical diagnosis of diabetes. You could provide the accommodations and supports that are needed through the IEP. Let's say that if the student had a comorbid diagnosis of a specific learning disability, you absolutely can provide the 504 accommodations through the IEP vehicle. We will again defer to your district's policies and procedures on if you can have both. But it is, I wouldn't say it's common that we see it across the state that a student has a 504 and an IEP, but it can happen. But again, the IEP can serve as the vehicle for the 504 supports. And again, it's fewer meetings for you and the parent, less documentation in terms of paperwork that you have to do if we can condense and have the IEP serve as the vehicle for those 504 accommodations. And in my opinion, too, it's just less confusing for the parent. To have separate meetings to discuss something that's probably overlapping and aligned to whatever is identified under the IEP. Chandra, any other thoughts there?
No, I just would agree that yes, a student can have both plans, but you really want to look at your district's practices there to determine if that's something that you want to actually implement in your districts. But as April said, a IEP could be used to address all the students' needs, whether those are needs in addition to the needs for the specialized instruction and some kind of medical diagnosis that the student may have can also be addressed in the IEP.
Perfect. I think we've hit on most. There was one specific question around facilities and accessibility. And Jeff, I'll have you email Chandra and me directly with that one because it is a specific district specific question. If you don't mind, send that over to us and I'll have Chandra and her team review and look at it. But I appreciate your thinking through what Chandra just mentioned about accessibility for your facilities. I love that you're already thinking so forward thinking. So yeah, email us. We'll have our contact information at the end. Let's kind of shift. We're going to dig into the evaluation pieces now. Keep the questions coming. You guys are asking great questions. So I alluded to before that there are times where even though parents are recommended team members where parent consent is required and parent participation is required. And you'll see two instances here where parents must be included, which is around initial consent for the initial evaluation and prior to the initial provision of services, which means the first 504 plan. So parents do need to provide written informed consent for that first evaluation as well as the first 504 plan prior to your implementation of that. If the parents fail to provide that consent, as Chandra just mentioned, your LEA does have some due process avenues to pursue if you would like. And then you can certainly reach out to her and her team if that is something that you're interested in pursuing. Parents, again, must sign consent for that initial evaluation in that first 504 plan. So I'm seeing a lot of questions around medical diagnoses, and I want to kind of frame our evaluation discussion around the first step that sometimes happens is that a parent brings you a medical diagnosis that says Johnny has been diagnosed with whatever disability, right? And where districts err is they take that diagnosis and they say, great, the student is eligible under Section 504, and we're going to provide a Section 504 plan. What happens though is that we forget that Section 504 requires us in our evaluations to ensure that we can answer these three questions. Does the student have a disability under Section 504? Well, if you get an outside diagnosis, yeah, we can answer that question, right? Sure, the student has a mental or physical impairment, that's right. But the next question that we have to be able to answer is, how does the disability substantially limit one or more major life activities? Typically, that outside diagnosis is not going to tell you how it substantially limits one or more major life activities. It's going to tell you what the disability is, probably listing out the disability code, right? It may give you a level of prognosis, but usually the physicians say good or, not, a mild impact to a moderate to a severe impact, but you're not sure how it substantially limits those major life activities. And then the third question is, what are the student's individual educational needs? Your evaluations must be able to answer these three questions. And if your evaluations are not comprehensive enough to do that, that tells us we need to beef up your evaluation processes, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But again, as you approach any referral, whether it comes from a teacher, where it comes from a parent, whether it comes from a medical provider, our obligation is to evaluate in order to answer these three questions. And we want to ensure too that we are evaluating in a manner that we're not unnecessarily identifying students who have a disability who may not have a disability, right? Chandra, if you don't mind going on to the next one for me, thank you. So we're going to come back to these three questions a lot as we're talking through. So what assessments should be completed? I get this question all the time. April, we have a referral for ADHD or for anxiety, and I need to know what to administer. Well, your team needs to come together to discuss what assessments are appropriate, but they should be based on a variety, as Chandra mentioned, a variety of information. If we're only using that medical diagnosis that was given to us as justification, we're actually not meeting the letter of the law because we don't have multiple sources of data to help answer those three questions. Does the student have a disability? How does it substantially limit? And then what are the needs, the educational needs of the child? Any assessments that are administered should be really geared towards the area of concern or this potential impact to those major life activities. And then we need to document that. If you are using the TM-Pulse system for your 504 management, we do need you to document within that eligibility form what evidence that you used in making that determination. There's nothing that requires a separate 504 report like you would see under IDEA, where an evaluation report is required to be provided to the parent and to show to the team essentially. But in this case, you guys have multiple mechanisms to document the results, whether within the TM-Pulse system or you do have an outside kind of summary of all the data that you've considered. You need to ensure that you have enough information to be able to answer those three questions and make the determination. Do they have a disabling condition, right? A disability under Section 504? Does it substantially limit? And then do the educational needs that you've identified through that process, can they be appropriately served through a 504 plan? So again, as we're thinking through, go ahead, Chandra, as you're thinking through how you're answering some of these questions, there are no restrictions on the types of assessments that you can administer. I get this question quite often. Well, we're not allowed to administer a cognitive test because that's too much like an IDA evaluation. Well, that's not necessarily true. You can administer any type of measure. So let's say you are evaluating a student for potential anxiety. And let's say you don't have an outside diagnosis, but your teacher has provided some information that shows that there may be some significant impact to that student, and they have a lot of anxiety when they're timed on tests or on assignments or when they come to unit exams. And so as you're evaluating, you can do rating scales, you can do informal checklists, you can do observations, you can pull your school psych or your school social worker in to do more formal anxiety type measures. I know I worked with a student in my previous life who had a pretty significant car accident, didn't rise to the level of a traumatic brain injury under IDEA, but we were looking at the repercussions of a concussion that he was having. So I administered several different cognitive subtests to look at his short-term, long-term memory, look at his processing speed and how that was going to be impacted. So really you can administer whatever you need with parental consent, obviously, to collect the information to help answer those three questions and inform your team's decisions, okay? Inform your team's decisions. And keep in mind, in some cases, you may need to loop in other faculty in your school building to assist you. If you are the 504 coordinator, a lot of times, I know Chandra and I say this all the time, sometimes if you are the school counselor and you have been told you are now the building level 504 coordinator, you may not know a lot about the different areas of disability or how to conduct an evaluation. So loop in as necessary your school psychologist, your school social worker. You can loop in your school nurse if it is a medical condition that you need their input on collecting information or doing observations or doing a good a medical interview with the parent, or obtaining a release of information to talk to the medical providers that are working with the child in an outside facility. Whatever you need, you absolutely can obtain consent to collect those pieces of information. Okay. So again, the purpose of the evaluation is to determine whether or not they meet criteria under Section 504 to be considered as a child with a disability. And then we want to ensure that the evaluation is constructed in a manner that is allowing your teams to ensure that students are not being misclassified or unnecessarily labeled as having a disability when they don't. So as we think through this, I want to also frame this around a lot of the questions we get from LEAs around um, um, extended time and read aloud. I would say those are the number two accommodations, the top two accommodations that we hear from LEAs that either parents are requesting or that the team is requesting for students. If you know that this is something that is being requested, why not build in some mechanisms within your assessment plan, right? To capture if this is something that will benefit the child in a way that will provide them an education comparable to non-disabled peers. So think through with me around reading fluency, or excuse me, around extended time. A lot of times, a lot of folks say extended time is what the children need. And certainly in a lot of cases that may be true, but we need to have some data to substantiate what the plan is. And often I see in meetings where the team does this great evaluation and then they get to the plan for Section 504 to build that out. And then we just hand the parents a master list of every accommodation that can be given, and we just say which ones would you like. And that is a practice that I would really encourage you to modify and update, because we should be choosing accommodations and services for students under Section 504 in the same manner we do under IDEA, which is we should have data to support the inclusion of those within the plan. And so if you know that a parent is saying extended time would be appropriate, let's ask our general education teachers to start collecting some evidence. How do they do when you give them extended time? Do they utilize it? How often do they utilize extended times? Do they perform comparably to non-disabled peers when they are or are not given extended time? What does that look like? And how can you collect that information through your evaluation process? Read aloud is another one that we hear a lot about. I know a lot of our folks across the state think this read aloud is this panacea that's going to help their children succeed. And we have to be really cautious that we have data to support, because many of you know on this call that read aloud needs to be tailored to a specific type of student. Do they have the cognitive capacity in terms of working memory, long-term memory, right? Their ability to retrieve information. If they're being read aloud a long set of paragraphs to be able to answer questions, they could be able to hold all of that information until we get to the question section. We need to ensure that we have data. So what type of data do we have to support or refute this, right? Maybe we're going to ask our general education teachers, okay, we have 60 days to evaluate for this 504. Do you mind over the next few weeks when you're doing a classroom read aloud, can you see through the results of that how Johnny does compared to non-disabled peers when he's being asked to read independently versus when he's being asked or when you're reading aloud and he's responding? Let's see if we can pull some data, right, around how he's performing. Maybe you're going to pull your school psych in to do some additional assessment to look at their listening comprehension, right? Because we all automatically assume that students, if they're not good readers, we can't assume that maybe they're also not great listeners and they cannot hold that information and comprehend that auditorially. We have to have that data to help support or refute, and building that plan out with your team is so vital. So again, we are not restrictive of what types of assessments we can do and what information we can consider. What I would always recommend is you have multiple sources of data to help support and answer those three questions. Typically, when I consult with districts, it is, well, we have a medical diagnosis and then we have some observations. Those two pieces are certainly valid pieces of information to consider, but what else can you collect, conduct to support responding to those three questions in order to substantiate if a child requires the supports through a 504 plan? Thanks, Chandra. So who makes this determination? The 504 team should be at minimum, should include the Section 504 coordinator, a principal, a district representative, what we would constitute as like the LEA, the local education agency representative, and then other professionals knowledgeable about the student. That includes maybe general education teachers, that could include maybe the school nurse or the school social worker, the school psych, whoever you need to bring in um, to ensure that there is a lot of stakeholders at the table who can speak to not only the child, but could help you answer those three questions through that evaluation process. Remember, parents should be invited. They should be given access and opportunities to be included into these meetings, but they are not necessarily required team members. Just document your opportunities to pull them in and to bring them in as much as you can. All right. I think we're going to shift to another "You Be the Judge" on the next slide. So Mr. Williams is very concerned. In September, 2 weeks after the new school year began, his 16-year-old son told him he was having a hard time hearing his teacher. And as a result, he is unable to take those detailed notes during the lectures. The school promised to evaluate the student, and Mr. Williams consented to that evaluation before the end of September. But now it's December. And to date, the evaluation has not yet started, never mind finish. What do you guys think? Throw it into chat of what you think. Should the school have completed the evaluation before December? I see a lot of yeses. See a couple A's. A, yes. See a B. See a lot of A's. See a couple B's. Somebody said, yep, not done within a reasonable period of time. Love that you guys are using that language. Love it. I see a lot of A's. All right, Chandra, let's see what we got here. Don't you love our legal answer? Probably. Not that A is wrong necessarily, but Section 504 again does not provide a specific time frame for that evaluation. Where there's that ambiguity, though, we lean into IDA. So 60 calendar days would be appropriate, but think through 60 calendar days. If we obtain consent at the end of September, then we have October, November, now it's in December. We probably should have completed that evaluation by that point, and we don't want to unnecessarily delay that process, right? And so as that we cited here under IDA and our state board rule, we need to ensure that students are evaluated within 60 days of the date of the receipt of consent. Nothing requires you to immediately turn around. Parents sign consent right now at 10:37 a.m. on a Friday to turn around and start the evaluation that same day. But we want to make sure that it's done in a reasonable time frame and we're not unnecessarily delaying or denying. So yes, probably the evaluation should have been completed by this point. Thank you all for your participation. So as you're evaluating, your big question is, does the student have a disability under Section 504? Many of you have put into chat, and I have a slide in the future, so I'm just going to kind of rain on my own parade that says, well, this parent provided me this medical diagnosis. The medical diagnosis is not required under Section 504. If you suspect a disability, you are obligated as the LEA to evaluate, even if you don't have a medical diagnosis. So the parent or the teacher suspects ADHD, or they suspect depression, anxiety, any of those things, you are required to evaluate regardless of any medical documentation. And you cannot require a parent to obtain medical documentation prior to considering an evaluation under Section 504. Your evaluation should be comprehensively sufficient to answer, do they have a disability under Section 504? You yourself are not diagnosing the child. You're looking at the massive amounts of data and evidence that you would be collecting to say that yes, this child has these characteristics of anxiety or depression that would require, through that provision of Section 504, accommodations or services to provide that education comparable to non-disabled peers. Okay, and you must determine this kind of on a case-by-case basis. We need to ensure that, again, we're not requiring this of parents, but we ourselves, if we suspect, we are moving to get consent to evaluate for a disability under 504. So what is an impairment? I think I alluded to this before. It can be really anything, right? I kind of jokingly state that, 4 years ago, 3 years ago now, we didn't know what COVID was, and we didn't certainly know what long COVID was. So we always need to ensure that we are taking any referrals on a case-by-case basis. I know I saw somebody in the chat drop a question around the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. That was a new inclusion within the DSM-5. It didn't exist prior to the DSM-5. So we always need to be amenable to considering any referral for any impairment that may impact a child. And so you'll see here that how 504 statute reads, it's any physiological condition that affects the bodily system, any mental or psychological disorder, and we'll look at a little bit more fine-tuned language on the next slide in terms of what can be included. Oh, I don't know why it did that. Goodness, that's a little odd. So again, I'm just going to kind of state that it can be anything. So I know I've served students under Section 504 plans for gastrointestinal issues, who had cancer, who had anything really can be included. Those who have learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, mental illness, any of those can be included. You'll see that list there around organic brain syndrome. This is an area that I'm hoping that at some point our Section 504 folks at the federal level will start to update. This is a very outdated term for memory-based disorders. So think dementia, Alzheimer's, those types of things. But again, we want to consider any referral that's coming to us and determine on a case-by-case basis if we should evaluate. As we note here, this is not an exhaustive list. We have new medical disabilities, new psychological disabilities all the time. So we don't necessarily want to say, well, we're going to go to this Section 504 list to see if it's listed here. We're going to consider each of those on a case-by-case basis. So major life activities. So I'm sure if I queried all of you and you look at this list here, this is again not an exhaustive list of those major life activities that could be impacted. But let's say for a student who has diabetes, think through yourself for a second, what major life activities could be impacted? It could be caring for oneself. Are they able to insert a needle into their own arm for insulin? Are they able to perform manual tasks? Are they able to stand, sleep, read, concentrate, eating, right? All of those could be impacted potentially for a student with diabetes. Your obligation, again, through your evaluation process, is to identify which of these areas could be impacted, are being impacted. Does it rise to that level of substantially limiting one of these areas? And then after you determine eligibility, your plan should address how you're going to provide access to these areas. So if it is a student with diabetes who does have issues with maintaining insulin levels, maybe they have to go see their school nurse throughout the day, maybe they're having to take breaks, maybe they're having to eat a snack at multiple periods throughout the day. The plan should provide those level of accommodations to address that, again, in order to ensure access to the general education curriculum in the general education classroom. On another example, think through a student who has maybe attention deficit disorder, right? What could be impacted here? Well, it could be a number of different things. And how is our evaluation going to be constructed and conducted in order to capture those areas that could be impacted? All right. And I will offer at the end of this, I probably will just send it out when Chandra and her team sends out. I have a lot of resources that you guys can utilize, free, informal checklists and tools that your team can utilize through this process. I will just make sure that those are attached and embedded within the email. I get a lot of questions around ADHD when there is no medical diagnosis, how you can help support that. There are a lot of informal checklists that you can use, or you absolutely can consult with your school psychologist. And we do have at our disposal ADHD rating scales that we can utilize to help support that decision-making process. Please loop in, again, the stakeholders within your school district that need to be a part of this to ensure that you're able to appropriately evaluate. A big question we always get is, April, what does substantial limitation mean? And unfortunately, this is not explicitly defined within 504 statute. It is kind of left to the 504 team to determine what that is. I know in our previous system, if you paid for the 504 platform under the Easy IEP Ed Plan system, there was like a Likert scale where you could say that it was at a 4 or 5, and that is no longer in our system because, again, we need your team to review the information that you have to make that determination. It's always done on that case by case basis, and it doesn't mean that the child can't do it. So I worked with a child who was going through chemotherapy treatments because of leukemia, and we put her. Actually, the team agreed to put her on an abbreviated schedule because in the afternoons, one, she was just so fatigued that she needed to rest, but then two, she had her chemotherapy treatments in the afternoon. Um, but part of that was that she wasn't able to do all of the activities within recess or at PE. And so our plan had to be somewhat calculated to say that she was able to participate in some of those activities. She just couldn't do it to the extent where the other kids could. So if she was required to run a mile for PE, maybe she was only having to run one lap and not do all of the laps, right? It doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means that they have a level of impairment that is restricting their ability to access whatever the requirement is. So we want to look at both the condition, not both, but all of the condition, the manner, the duration of which these students can perform the major life activity compared to non-disabled peers. And that's where we're going to get our kind of our litmus test to know um, if it does substantially limit them or if it doesn't. And that, again, is going to be based on that unique profile that you're building out with all the data that you're collecting through that evaluation process. Another you be the judge here. Shannon's 7th grade teachers report that she often falls asleep without warning during class and misses instruction. Her parents insist that she gets a good night's sleep, but note that the pediatrician told them Shannon might have narcolepsy, a chronic brain disorder that involves poor sleep control and wake patterns. All right, what do you guys think the teachers should do here? See a lot of C's. C, 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 C. Perfect. Yes, we should speak with the 504 coordinator to determine if an evaluation is appropriate. These other areas Again, we are not going to require that the parent provide anything to us. If we suspect a disability, and we have that suspicion based on whatever information we have, whether it's the teacher's observations or the parent alluded to that there could be a disability, we're gonna consider that and move forward with an evaluation if that is appropriate. Remember that before they receive that plan, they must be properly evaluated. Nothing is automatic here. Just because she's falling asleep, we have this suspicion that she might have narcolepsy because of what the parent provided. That alone wouldn't automatically justify a 504 plan. We must evaluate to determine what those needs and services are.
April, do we want to pause for questions before
Yeah,
moving into this
I got
next
a little
section about what
lost.
gotten into a 504 plan? I know
I
we've gotten
think
some questions that
so.
are going to be answered in the upcoming slides, but I think there are lots of questions around the evaluation process.
Let me go back because within the chat box, I'm having to wade through all their responses here. Let me go back and see if I can make sure I can find them. Um, I see a question around, I think this was going back to our question around IEP and 504. Is it still appropriate if eligibility is speech impairment only and the medical disability is diabetes? Absolutely, Whitney. They could still just have the IEP to serve as the vehicle for the 504 accommodations. I would just ensure in the medical information under the IEP that you're noting that the student's disabling condition is diabetes. And you can even put within the prior written notice that they will be served through the IEP for their 504 accommodations for their medical impairment. That's absolutely fine. We're going to address that a little bit more with the modified abbreviated schedule. So I'm going to put a pin in that question around modified abbreviated schedule once Chandrea gets there. I see a couple people putting input around they do separate speech impairment from other disabling conditions because they sometimes exit quickly through speech. And again, we'll defer to your district policies and procedures on that. Can you give us some examples of data to use besides medical documents? I think that we've talked through what you can use. I'm also going to send and share with you a lot of informal checklist observation tools that you can use. I also have a really great student interview form that will help you understand the student's needs within the school day. And then there's also a couple accompanying parent documentations that you can provide parents to get a good social, emotional, developmental history from the parent, which may be helpful. So I'll make sure that we send those out to all of our attendees. The evaluation for a 504 does not require a school psychologist. It does not require a school psychologist, but certainly you can loop in the school psychologist if necessary. I know when I was still practicing as a school psych, I participated in almost all of my building level 504 evaluations. It's not required, but they certainly can be included if your team feels that you need some additional evidence that the school psych can help you collect. There's a question around the appropriateness of school counselors to be 504 coordinators. We cannot speak to that. We'll defer. These are based on your district policies and procedures. There are some districts that the school counselors are the 504 coordinators. There are others that it's administrators or that they have designated somebody else in their district. This is all dependent on your district policies and procedures.
And I'll add to that as well. So the Section 504 regulations do have some specific requirements as it relates to when a school is required or when, any entity that's receiving federal funds that is or that has obligations under Section 504 is required to have a coordinator. And that's the standard outlined by the federal regulations. I believe it's when they employ at least 15 individuals. In regards to that, they're thinking about at the district level. But again, as April said, as it relates to school-based 504 coordinators, we defer to your districts on what their practices or procedures are there.
I see a question that says, I gather all the data that parent and I have discussed. The parent then brings up another accommodation during the plan meeting. How do I gather information when I'm not informed until the parent is there in front of me? I think this always is where that pre-referral process is so important to talk through all of the areas of suspected disability, but then also talk about all the areas that may not have been addressed through the initial referral process. So talking to the teachers to say, okay, what are you seeing in the classroom? What supports are you already providing? What are some that you would necessarily think that you could provide if the student does qualify that we may want to explore? You may always get parents who bring up other ideas. You are absolutely entitled to evaluate in order to determine what's going to be included in the plan. So if you already have determined eligibility, you already have a plan in place, parents bring up another potential accommodation, and maybe you don't have the evidence to support it, you are entitled to evaluate, to collect the information to justify the inclusion there. So feel free, use the opportunity if you need to go ahead and put that initial plan into place and tell parents we're going to obtain some additional information to support or refute their recommendation. Okay, I'm going to scroll quickly down. I see if I missed anything else. You guys are so participatory. I'm so appreciative of you guys throwing things into the chat box and answering our questions. Oh, let me go back up. I just missed a bunch. Okay. I see. What if you evaluate in a Connors score? A Connors is a rating scale that looks at inattention, hyperactivity, indicate inattention. What do we do? Then if that is your referral, if you suspect ADHD, the inattentive type, then if that's what you're evaluating for, then that would be a good justification. If all of your other data helps support that there is the ADHD inattentive type, then that would help support that. Do your observations show the same thing? I would collect always really good, in my opinion, data by observing, by looking at that student compared to maybe two other typical peers of the same age and sex in the classroom, and looking at their level of attention or inattention. I would maybe even just draft out the percentages. Johnny was attending to instruction 50% of the time. Typical peers were at 82% of the time, however that looks. But yeah, I would say that would be a really great tool to use if you don't have an outside diagnosis for ADHD. Are we required to evaluate for 504 if the parent suspects a disability, but the school staff has no evidence or data that leads us to suspect a disability? Chandra, do you want to take that one?
I can. And I think this is a question that we just got recently from an LEA as well. So if you have convened a team, or even if you're reviewing an evaluation that's been submitted and the school determines that they do not suspect the student has a disability, you do not have that obligation to evaluate. Remember, these are going to be decisions that are going to be made by the team of individuals who are knowledgeable about the student, who make this determination. Again, this is where your parents are going to use their grievance options, right? So if the parent has a different determination here, they have a different understanding here, they can use those procedural safeguards, that due process hearing request process to challenge the determination here made about the evaluation of this student.
Perfect. If we get a prescription diagnosis from a doctor, but have not gotten any communication from a parent or any concerns from the teachers, are we still required to do a formal evaluation? I'll say two things on that. I hope that doctors are not just sending you information without parents' permission to share that information. That would be a concern for me around HIPAA, but maybe they did receive consent from the parent to send that over. I would just touch base with the parent and let them know that you've received this and that you would like to consider this formally, and just talk through that with the parent. We want to make sure that any information we're provided, we are considering. And if the medical provider has received consent to release that information to you, then obviously the parent probably wants you to consider that. So just reach out to the parent and start whatever process you have within your district to consider that formally. I see a question around talk more about a school's ability to diagnose characteristics of So again, if we don't have an outside diagnosis, nothing within 504 statute requires us, one, we can't require the parent to provide that, but it does require us to evaluate to determine if they, again, we're not diagnosing a disability for them, but we're looking at all the evidence and data that we've collected to say that we can be fairly certain that they meet this criteria, right? Or that they have a disabling condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities. We're not diagnosing, but we're looking at the plethora of information that we're collecting to say this disabling condition, whether it's formally diagnosed or not, substantially limits one or more major life activities. Now we can say they meet, they're eligible, and that we're going to build out a plan based on that data. Okay. Technically eligible. I'm not sure. Chandra, do we have another area on technically eligible?
I'm
I'm
not
not
sure
sure.
that we have another, but I know we kind of talked about it at the start of the presentation. Remember, you may have students who, after you've completed the evaluation process, the determination is made they do not have a disability that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Therefore, they do not need any kind of accommodations or special education and related aids and services. That could be a student that would be marked as technically eligible in the TN Post platform and would be considered technically eligible. So it may be determined that they have that condition, but don't need those additional supports.
Perfect. I see a couple of questions around IHPs, individual health plans. Chandra is going to talk about that in just a moment, so put a pin in that one as well. You guys are psychics. You're getting ahead of us here. You're doing great. I see with diabetes, this would be a good one for you, Chandra. If a student plays an after-school sports team, has diabetes, what is the school's responsibility for care during that sports event?
So, as far as it relates to the responsibility for care for that student, remember it's more so about the student being able to access that particular activity. You want to definitely make a determination on a case by case basis what the particular student's needs are. And I'll say as well, with Section 504, and we're going to talk about this as well in an upcoming slide. I think we talk about it more so as it relates to students with like food allergies. But the school should be required to allow the student to access any kind of medication that they may have, but there's not necessarily the requirement for administering the medication as well. So you want to be sure that you are really looking at this on a case by case basis, supporting that particular student's needs, and ensuring access for participation in those programs.
Love it. Thank you. Okay, that's IHP. I see some questions around, are there office hours for 504 questions? You can always reach out to me or Chandra and her team. We answer a lot of 504 questions, and we will absolutely consider maybe hosting some quarterly 504 office hours to answer or ask questions. I see some recommendations around adding the informal checklist to TN Pulse. I will talk with our leadership to see if that is possible. Some of those informal checklists that I have are just for my own toolbox, and so they're not TDOE sanctioned checklists. So some of those I think we could upload, and some others I'm just going to have to email you, and you'll just have to keep in your documents tab of your laptop. I think this is similar. I think you just answered this, Chandrea, but if a student has ADHD and is not affecting her in the classroom, I'm assuming not affecting any major life activities. I'm going to say it that way. Does the fact that she takes medication for ADHD make her technically eligible but no accommodations?
And I think there again, there would need to be the evaluation to make that determination, but there could be a possibility. This could be an example of a student who's considered technically eligible.
Perfect. Okay. I do see a question about the 504 at a glances. Those are provided within the TM Pulse system, so it lists out all the accommodations. So I know this is not a TM Pulse training, but there are 504 accommodations at a glance if you are using the TM Pulse system for your management. And I think, let me see. Somebody asked, couldn't parent observations be used as part of the data? Absolutely. Please use parent observations. Parents are critical team members as well, right? And so if they have information that's being provided to you, please include that within your data collection system. What I would caution you is just to rely on parent input. We want to make sure that we have some input from the educational providers in the school district to make sure that our plan is going to be sufficient for that student. I see, do any districts they're asking, I'm sorry, that is a private question to me. Um, Somebody said we do teacher observations with the medical diagnosis. What else wouldn't be needed? Teacher observations are critical, absolutely, but we want a variety of sources. So right now you tell me that we have a medical diagnosis and teacher observations. Again, what else could we collect? Maybe there are some informal checklists. Maybe we're going to look at the student's ability to complete tasks, or maybe we're going to interview and consult with the parent. Make sure it's a variety of sources. And for me, I typically would state, two sources are good, but we want to have a variety and looking at from a variety of perspectives of what's being impacted and how it's being impacted across settings. You guys are fast fingers on. For the sake of time, I think we're going to need to keep going here, Chandrea. And
Mhm.
at the end,
I agree.
if we need to, we'll stop the recording and then we can answer any of these other questions given time constraints. You guys are asking great questions. Are you okay with that, Chandrea, to keep rocking and
Yes,
rolling?
I am. And we'll move into this next section and then we'll take our last and final break for the training. So we're going to go ahead and move into our next few slides here on who or what can go into a Section 504 plan.
Yeah, so what can go, and I know I've been alluding to this throughout our evaluation conversation. So often most people think that 504 plans are just vehicles for accommodations. That's not actually accurate. You can provide accommodations, and as you see here, modifications or related services. So think through your one of the questions around after school sports and diabetes. Maybe the student also needs some school nurse support throughout the school day to administer insulin or check blood levels, or they need a special transportation to get to and from school. Any of these related services can be provided to students. Now, again, I would always caution you, please consult with your special education directors. If your 504 team is going to make a recommendation, some of these folks may be paid under special education funds, and we need to consult with our special education directors if any of these are going to be made as a recommendation. But certainly any of these accommodations, and these are not exhaustive lists, but should be based on any of the data that you're collecting through your evaluation process. I think we answered this already, but is it a medical diagnosis required to qualify? No, it is not required to qualify. We will consider that data along with other data sources that we are using, but it is not required, and we should not. Excuse me. And we should not be requiring parents to provide a medical diagnosis prior to considering a 504 evaluation. Does having a medical diagnosis automatically qualify? I think I've answered this too. We need to move these slides up to the front. No, a medical diagnosis does not automatically qualify, but it should be considered because it could be the catalyst, the trigger for us to suspect a disability under 504 and the need to conduct evaluation. So whatever parents are providing you, or if you're having outside providers mail or email you things, you need to consider those, but it doesn't automatically qualify them because that disability in and of itself doesn't mean that it substantially limits one or more major life activities, and that's the purpose of your evaluation. Mitigating measures. So I'm going to say this because it's kind of a mouthful, but as of January 1st, 2009, school districts cannot consider, should not consider, must not consider the ameliorating effects of any mitigating measures that the student is using. So ameliorating is the lessening effects. Let me give you this example. So Johnny was referred for ADHD evaluation. There is no medical diagnosis. The team suspects ADHD. They're starting to evaluate. About 30 days into the 60-day timeline, the teacher comes to you and she says, April, it's a miracle. I'm not sure what happened, but he's on task. He's completing assignments. He's participating. He's organized, he remembers to bring his homework back, something has happened. So because you're a curious, investigative soul, you call the parent and the parent says, oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you about 2 weeks ago, we started him on a prophylactic a psychostimulant, right? We're on some type of stimulant medication. Should you, when you get to that eligibility meeting, in order to determine eligibility, should you consider Johnny pre-medication or post-medication given this statement around mitigating measures? What do you guys think? Pre-medication, post-medication? You don't have to put it in the chat if you don't have time. Based on this, we should not be considering the ameliorating effects of any mitigating measures. And Chandra, if you pop over to that next slide, medication is considered to be a mitigating measure. So we need to consider Johnny pre-medication, right? Because we all know on this call, medications change, medications stop. We need to ensure that we are determining his eligibility based on pre-medication, not post. Now, this is again where Chandrea said that technically eligible comes into play. Maybe the student, due to the medication and that ameliorating effects of that medication, doesn't require a 504 plan, but we can state within the system that he is technically eligible. So if anything changes with the mitigating measure, we can quickly get that plan up and running if we need to. But again, this is not an exhaustive list of these mitigating measures, but please make sure that you are not using the medication in and of itself or any of these other mitigating measures to deny eligibility under Section 504. Couple more slides for me and I'll pass it back over to Chandrea. Transitory impairment. This again, I think I alluded to with COVID and long COVID. We get a lot of questions and we got a lot of questions around during COVID around transitory impairment, but an individual is not regarded as an individual with a disability if the impairment is transitory and minor in nature. And how it's defined is that the impairment with actual or expected duration of 6 months or less. That would be a transitory impairment. That would not be covered under Section 504, but we would certainly encourage you to resolve these on a case-by-case basis, taking into consideration the needs of the child. Let me give you this example because I'm sure it will come up for you this year, especially as we approach TCAP season in the spring. Johnny is climbing a tree, he's doing his daredevil technique, and he falls and he breaks his dominant riding arm, and we're getting ready to start, and he has to take the riding portion of the TCAP. Even though that this may be considered a transitory impairment, we're going to make sure that the child has access to the statewide assessment. And if that means that your team needs to consider if a 504 plan is appropriate, you may do that. Again, all of these impairments should be considered on a case-by-case basis. We shouldn't just say unilaterally, oh, the child has this eligible or this diagnosis, that doesn't qualify. Always on a case-by-case basis and documenting that you did consider it.
Okay, and we can get started moving into our next section here. We are going to reserve some time at the end to answer some of the remaining questions in the chat and any additional questions that may come up during this last portion of our training today. So in this section, we're going to talk about some other considerations. These are really a compilation of topics that where we get frequently asked questions about these particular areas and just trying to provide some additional information about support for these particular topics that may come up in districts. So the first of those topics is related to health-related services. So generally, Section 504 obligates districts to provide students with disabilities with those health-related services that are required to be performed during the school day. So if there is a need for a student to see the school nurse, to check their insulin levels, then that may be a service that the school can provide for the student. If there is a need for students to see the school nurse to take some kind of medication as well, that may be a support that the school can provide the student throughout the school day. Any of those particular needs or supports for students can be added to the student's Section 504 plan as it relates to supports or accommodations or related aids and services that are going to be noted for the student. And remember that the school does have that obligation to ensure that the student has access to those medications or whatever those health-related needs are during the school day. That could include health care, that could include nutrition as it relates to students who may have some kind of food allergies or unique food needs as well. We'll talk about special diets here on this next slide. So as it relates to special diets, if food is provided to all students, then it must be provided to students with disabilities who have a special dietary need on the same basis as the food is provided to the non-disabled students. So say, for instance, there is some kind of snack that is being provided to students during the course of the day. If it's provided to non-disabled peers and there are students with special dietary needs, then they must also be provided some kind of snack option as well. If there is some kind of treat that is being shared with the class, if we're providing treats to all students in that class who are non-disabled, then there must be an option for students with special dietary needs as well. If we have an instance where a student is going to need to maybe snack more frequently during the day because of a disability, say such as diabetes, remember that the district is not required to provide those snacks unless this is a time where snacks are being provided to all students. So if you have a student who is needing to, chew on some kind of candy or peppermint during out or throughout the day to maybe help regulate their blood sugar levels. That would be something that the student would be expected to provide unless there's a time where snacks are being provided to all students. I think we've already kind of gotten some questions about individual health plans today. And what's important to know about a health plan, and I think from seeing some of the questions that this group has asked about plans, is that yes, students can have both a health plan and a Section 504 plan. It really depends on your district, what practice you decide to employ. It could be that if the student has a 504 plan, those particular health needs could be covered in the 504 plan. But what we want to caution you about is that health plans cannot serve as a substitute for Section 504 plans. Health plans are going to be put in place for students where there is a medical need, right? And there is no indication that the student's disability is substantially limiting one or more major life activity. But if we have made that determination that the student does need that Section 504 plan and does need those accommodations or related aids and services, then you must complete that evaluation process. You must put that plan in place for the student and not use a health plan as a substitute to kind of try to circumvent the Section 504 evaluation and plan development process. Services provided in a health plan are usually mitigating measures. As I said, it could be the administration of medication for students or visits to the school nurse, even as it relates to needs for self care for a student as well. And again, we want to encourage districts to really evaluate their practices to ensure that 504 plans, or I'm sorry, 504 evaluations are being conducted when necessary to determine eligibility of students. So this is one of the sections that we've gotten lots of questions about today, and April has mentioned a couple of times that we're going to address this question about attendance. So students receiving special educational related aids and services provided under Section 504 may need modified school schedules. And what that means here is that the school district is going to really need to make a determination on a case by case basis what is necessary for that particular student. Is there a need for part-time days, alternating days, some kind of specific time to indicate in that student's 504 plan, or in the case of a student who is receiving services under IDEA, their IEP? We want you all to be cautious about providing any kind of blanket excuses for attendance in these plans, and really make determinations about what is needed on a case by case basis for these students. Schools should also really consider what supports or accommodations will allow the student to return to school the full day as possible. If there is a plan that's put in place that allows for some kind of modification of the schedule. Remember, the goal should be that the student is in attendance and that they are in the educational setting, just as their non-disabled peers. And remember, If there is a decision to shorten the school day or to make some modifications to a student's schedule, it should only be done if the student continues to receive FAPE. So if FAPE can no longer be provided to the student because of a modification of a schedule, then we need to think of other options for those students and other ways to accommodate those students in the school setting. That leads to discussions about homebound. We really get a lot of questions about homebound when thinking about, if there's a need to modify a student schedule or make adjustments to a student schedule. And what we want you all to know is that homebound is going to be considered for one of two reasons. There's either going to be a medical homebound certification of a student, and we have a state board rule that describes the process for making determinations about medical homebound. This is going to be instruction provided in the home or at a hospital or at an other related location to students who are unable to attend school due to medical conditions. An example here would be a student who is medically fragile. With the medical homebound, it requires a certification from a medical doctor. The actual state board rule outlines what kinds of medical professionals can provide that certification. And remember, you must comply with the requirements of the state board rule here for making the determination about if the student qualifies for medical homebound, and then any evaluations of their medical homebound placement and the timeline for conducting those evaluations of the medical homebound placement as well. With educational homebound, there will be two instances. Either it is documented in the student's IEP or Section 504 plan. I will say this too: that the most likely case is going to be a student with an IEP under IDEA who is being served under educational homebound. It's not as likely that a student with a 504 plan would be served under educational homebound. And remember, the team has to determine that instruction in the home or hospital or related setting is the student's least restrictive environment. An example would be the student's behavioral needs require instruction in the home. And then kind of adding to what we are discussing here about homebound, like IEPs, students with 504 plans, if they are placed on homebound and it's identified through their IEP, they should be evaluated, or I'm sorry, those plans should be reviewed every 30 days to ensure the continued appropriateness of instruction in that homebound placement and to continue to ensure that that is the least restrictive environment for the student. And April, I know I'm gonna pass it over to you, but anything else to say about homebound here? Because I know we get lots of questions about homebound and attendance.
There was one question related to that. If maybe we can give an example around educational homebound, let me know if you want me to.
And give an example around when a student may need educational homebound or
Correct.
so I think the example that we had on the slide would be when a student has behavior needs that will require education in the home. So let's say that we have a student who has behaviors where they're having just concerns with adjusting to the school day, adjusting to that school setting. That may be a team where the team has decided that the homebound setting may be most appropriate for the student. Let's say that the student is, there's some safety concerns about the student self-harming or harming others in the school setting. That may be an example in which homebound may be the least restrictive environment for that particular student. But again, that is going to be a team decision made on really looking at the data regarding that particular student and that particular student's behaviors, that particular student's needs, and the need to review that placement option every 30 days is still going to be there.
Perfect. I think, was this you or me? We get a lot of questions around post-secondary settings, dual enrollment, that type of thing. So I'm glad that we added this in here. College and universities that do receive federal assistance are required and are covered by Section 504 and are required to provide reasonable accommodations for qualifying students. but they are not required to adopt the Section 504 plan implemented by your district. Often we get questions from parents saying, well, I want my child to have a 504 plan because it goes with them to college. Unfortunately, the day that they walk across that stage and earn their regular diploma, their IEP and their 504 plan stops, and they can go to their disability resource office at the applicable college or university and request reasonable accommodations. But their university or college is going to have their own set of policies and procedures that they must adhere to. So again, if you do have any students who are in dual enrollment, you need to consult with your local board attorney, your directors of school, to understand what the process is and how to advise them to obtain reasonable accommodations through that applicable college or university. Another You Be the Judge. Maya has a 504 plan due to her inability to concentrate as a result of her ADHD. Her plan provides extended time and classroom aid to keep her on task. Midway through the year, Maya's dad begins to notice a drop in her reading scores and informs her team. The student is working hard to remain on task during reading, but she's still struggling to complete assignments that in the amount of time provided. The dad requests that maybe she be evaluated for an IEP. How should the school respond? What do you guys think? Go ahead and drop your responses into the chat. Oops. I see a lot of bees, 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 bees. All right, yes. Hold a meeting to discuss dad's concerns. Absolutely. So when the parents make a special education evaluation request, we need to consider that request and determine how we're going to appropriately respond to that. We're not going to automatically state that, yes, we can give the child an IEP. We're going to determine if we need to open that evaluation and evaluate under IDA, but we need to consider that request and we'll document our decision to either propose the evaluation or refuse that through a prior written notice. Great job, everyone.
Okay, and we're going to move into this last section that discusses discipline. April, any questions before we transition?
There are a few questions, but I think let's hold those because we're already over time, and let's hold those to the end, and then whoever wants to stay on can stay on.
Okay, and April, we have until 12:30 today. That's our set time for ending
Oh, I
the
was
training
thinking
today.
it was 11:30. Never mind. We have plenty of time then.
Okay, so moving into this section on discipline, a couple of things that we want to discuss here. First, being the manifestation determination review. So, a district must conduct an evaluation of any person who needs or is believed to need special education or related services before taking action with respect to the initial placement of the person or for any, or I guess that's an and rather, any subsequent significant change in placement. That is the exact language from the Section 504 regulations that requires the evaluation, which is known in this instance as a manifestation determination review for students with disabilities under Section 504. And some things to think about as it relates to MDRs. First is who's going to serve on that manifestation determination review team? Who's a part of your MDR team? Well, really, it's going to be the same set of folks who make up your 504 team, right? It's going to be people knowledgeable about the student, the meaning of the evaluation data, and the placement options. And that comes directly from a OCR memorandum on this particular topic. So here we want to include our same members who are generally a part of the students 504 team. That's going to be, maybe our school-based Section 504 coordinators, maybe the appropriate educators who are going to share information about the student's performance in the classroom or how that disability may be impacting that particular student and limiting a major life activity. It may be individuals who have participated in that evaluation process, who have that understanding of the evaluation data. And then as far as understanding our placement options, our school administrators, right, are going to be the ones who are understanding the different placement options that are available for students. The purpose of the MDR is to determine whether the student's misconduct was caused by or it's related to the student's physical or mental impairment, and really trying to make a determination of, is this conduct that occurred because of the student's particular disability. We'll get into some next steps about, if there's a determination that the conduct is related to the student's physical or mental impairment, how the school should then address the concerns. But if we determine that it's not related to that conduct, then the school can administer discipline the same as they would for any other student who has engaged in that type of conduct. So we have our next "You Be the Judge" here. So here we have a student, Keaton, who has Tourette syndrome. He's a fifth grader at Mountain Middle School. And sometimes his condition causes him to involuntarily yell out explicit language. Um, these incidents rarely happen, but in this particular instance, he does yell out some random curse words. And the school has a policy that the use of profanity is automatically going to result in a 2-day detention for students. Keaton yells out these curse words in his music class, and the music teacher is taken aback immediately, sends Keaton to the office. An administrator, unaware of Keaton's condition, gives Keaton the 2-day detention disciplinary action. Keaton's father is furious, accuses the school of discriminating against his son based on his disability. And our question for you here is, did the school discriminate against this student based on his disability? And I see we don't have ABC options here, unfortunately. So you can give us a yes or no or maybe as an option as well.
I see a lot of yeses and a lot of maybes.
Okay. And I think here some folks may have been thinking about from the first time where we had the probably as the answer. So here, again, our answer here is going to be maybe, right? So one of those lawyerly answers, I know. But this particular fact pattern was pulled from an OCR case resolution, like some of our others. And here in this particular instance, Section 504, it does not, as I mentioned before, it does not prohibit the school from disciplining students with disabilities. However, the school may not discipline a student with a disability if they've determined that the conduct is based on the student's disability. So they may not do it in a discriminatory manner. A school policy or practice that is neutral on its face may still have unjustified discriminatory effects if it would lead to denying a student with disability meaningful access to the school's aids, benefits, or services. So here again, we want to be sure that our policies are flexible enough to make determinations on a case-by-case basis for all of our students. So even here where we saw the student had or the school kind of had an automatic policy that if a student engaged in this conduct of using explicit language, then the result would be the 2-day detention. There must be some exceptions here for the consideration of students with disabilities whose disability may be what led to the possible conduct here. Also, it's important to note that the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights may find that a policy that automatically imposes a detention for any type of language to be discriminatory. So again, you want to have that flexibility in your policies and in your procedures related to discipline so it doesn't lead to discriminatory effects. And that was our last slide in this section. April, I know we have a host of questions in the chat that we want to address before we conclude our training.
Yes, let me get back there. There's a lot of discussion around why some of the faculty didn't know about the 504 plan potentially in the example you gave, which I agree. Yes, we should
Yep.
ensure that everybody who is an interested party for that student knows what the accommodations are, knows what the behavior plan is, knows how to implement if necessary. All right.
And definitely good observation there, and good to see too that folks are thinking about that.
Somebody asked if a child with a 504 plan is moved from one school of choice, like a magnet school, back to their school of zone due to not meeting program requirements, is this considered a change of placement that requires a manifestation determination? So, and make sure and feel free to correct me in the chat here. So manifestation determinations, when we talk about change of placement, it is due to a disciplinary infraction, a code of conduct violation, not necessarily, and because I don't know the whole scope of this, not meeting program requirements. So if there is maybe an attendance requirement or parent participation requirement or something like that, that is a different topic. So if a student violates the code of conduct, and they are sending him back to his school of zone, then yes, a manifestation determination should be held prior to terminating his eligibility for that program. We want to ensure that we're not removing access to that program if the misconduct was due or had a direct substantial relationship to the child's disability. And feel free to correct me in there too if I'm not understanding what your question was. Let me scroll all the way back to see if we've missed any other questions. Somebody asked about going back to your snacks, dietary restriction slide. What if a parent is providing the treats for the class?
Mhm.
Thoughts on that, Chandrea?
So if a parent is providing treats for a full class of students, if you do have students in that class with disabilities and they have dietary restrictions, remember if you're providing it for all of the students in that class, and there must be some options for the student with the dietary restrictions as well. So that just may be something that that teacher needs to take into consideration when they are having parents or when parents are asking to bring in those treats for students.
Perfect. Going back again to those health-related services you were talking about, I think we alluded to this during the accessibility piece, but what about a field trip? And maybe possibly the field trip is out of state. Um, what are the obligations of the school system to provide those health-related services if on those field trips, regardless of where they are?
And I'm sorry, can you repeat that one, April?
I'm sorry, yes. So what
Not
about a
sure I
field
heard
trip for
everything.
those health-related services that the school's obligated to provide? If the child with a disability is going to go on a potentially like an out-of-state field trip, what are
Mhm.
the school's obligations to provide those services?
So again, if that is some kind of programming that is accessible by non-disabled peers, then the school is going to be required to ensure access for the student with a disability as well. Really make a determination about what that access needs to look like and what kinds of services or supports are going to be needed for that student. And always consult your board attorney on those types of situations as well, even for in-state field trips or in-town field trips as well. Be sure to consult your legal team for guidance on what particular supports the school may be required to provide for the student, and to ensure that the school is not engaging in any kind of discriminatory practices as it relates to sharing information about what may be necessary for the student to participate or attend.
Perfect. Question, I think to differentiate between medical education home, if a student with a 504 goes homebound through medical reasons, so a medical homebound, is a 504 meeting required due to the placement change? I would certainly recommend that your team considers meeting to understand how, whether their services or accommodations will be provided in that medical homebound setting. So who's administering those? Is there a big change to the plan? I absolutely would recommend that you consider that. And also note that this may also constitute a significant change of placement that would also necessitate potentially a reevaluation on your team's part. So just consider what that would look like for this particular student. Let me go back down. Oh, we've got a lot more questions in since we opened it up for Q&A time. Um, should parents be encouraged to request a 504 if they choose to not receive SPED services or if the child has met goals, objectives, and services are no longer needed? Do you want me to take that one, Chandrea?
Yes.
I don't think necessarily that we want to encourage, but I do think it's well within your LEA's right to consider if a 504 is appropriate. So remember the circles, right? When we step out of IDA, that innermost circle, what land are we in? We're in 504 land. So I think if a child no longer qualifies or the parent has revoked consent for those services, I think it is in your best interest to consider if a 504 plan is appropriate. Okay. Again, it's not automatic. You would still need to consider and go through your evaluation process as necessary. But I think it's wise to consider. Good question.
And just to add to that, I remember kind of the first question that you're considering when determining whether to evaluate a student under Section 504 is whether the school suspects the student has a disability or I'm sorry, a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. So if there's still that suspicion there, then it definitely may be appropriate for the LEA to really share with the parent that a Section 504 evaluation may be needed.
Perfect. What if I have a student with a 504 who is not using their accommodations, but the parent is adamant that they have them and blames us when the parent does not do well on an assignment or test? I get this question a lot, especially as students get older. There is often some stigma that is behind accessing certain accommodations, but I want to kind of reframe your question and change that language. So students should not necessarily be having to request to use, unless that's explicitly stated in their plan that they must request for an accommodation. Um, Teachers should be providing those. And then if the students are absolutely adamantly refusing to access those within that setting, I think you need to hold a meeting and you need to discuss that with your 504 team, with the parents. And at that point, if the student is still refusing, then it sounds like they're old enough to be a part of that conversation. So you can dig into why they're refusing it. Maybe it's because they feel they don't need it. Maybe they don't understand what the accommodation is for and what's being provided to them. Maybe they don't have a good understanding of their disability and the impact of their disability. It sounds like there needs to be a bigger conversation within the 504 team, and we need to loop in the student to participate in that process. But we don't want to just remove eligibility because the student is refusing. We need to kind of do our due diligence. Do we need to educate the student a little bit more on this? Do we need to ensure that the teachers are not creating an environment that could feel a little like the student is excluded or different from the rest of the students? We need to ensure that all of those pieces are being considered prior to making a recommendation for termination of an eligibility plan. Chandra, anything else there? I think you probably could speak to a lot around discriminatory practices there that would probably be at play.
Yes, wanting to ensure that the students' accommodations are not being eliminated, or that our opportunity for accommodations are not being eliminated for the student when there is a need for it. Many times, and I know that it was kind of framed as, the parent may have some concerns, or the parent is kind of placing blame on the school for those accommodations not being used by the student. There are definitely instances in which that could turn into a complaint by the parent as it relates to some form of a complaint with OCR alleging discrimination based on the student's disability. So, wanting to ensure that whatever supports are outlined in the Section 504 plan for the student really understands the need for those accommodations and understands how to use those accommodations. And really, there's some conversation, as April was mentioning, with the student to get them to really understand just how those supports are going to be of benefit and of service to the student, and really ensuring that they are understanding how to use those as well. And then just making, if there's a need for evaluating if those are the appropriate supports for the student as well, are there other options that could be available for the student?
Perfect. Can a parent refuse IDA services and opt for a 504 instead? Or if they refuse IDA, they're also refusing 504? I know some states interpret the situation differently.
I think that's a question we get pretty often about a parent maybe refusing the evaluation under IDEA and maybe opting for the 504 or demanding that the 504 evaluation proceed. Something to remember here, as we talked about parental consent and due process being available for districts if they suspect a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, but don't obtain that parental consent. There is a similar option under IDEA, and I know April can probably speak to this a little bit more. But if the LEA is suspecting that the student needs that specialized instruction, then that may be the path that the LEA is needing to take there, and there may be a need for some consideration about whether or not the district needs to pursue due process under IDEA.
Absolutely. Student with 504 is experiencing tier 2, tier 3 truancy. A manifestation is not needed, question mark. And Chandra, I know under IDEA and our SEPSA law, the Special Education Behavioral Supports Act for truancy, there's embedded some language that manifestation is required for truancy, but I'm not sure if that extends to 504. So I'll
And
let
this
you
is one I
kind of take
actually
that
want to
one.
research and come back to. So Amanda, if you allow us to take this question, research and follow up with you via email, if you'll send us and you'll see our contact information on the next slide. If you'll send us this question in email, then we can get a response.
And I know on our side of things with IDA, it's never necessarily wrong to hold an MDR when one isn't held. It is a problem if you don't hold one when you need to hold an MDR. But I think it's if you are seeing students with disabilities who are not attending school, you need to call a meeting to understand why. Be proactive with those processes. And as far as when we get conversations with parents or when you guys reach out with questions, the student's so far into truancy that now you really don't have an understanding of why. And if it isn't related to the disability, that's when your team needs to come together. Does the plan need to be updated or modified? Do we need to consider an IDA evaluation and eligibility? Do we need to consider modified abbreviated schedule? Are we still able to provide the student FAPE within the current setup? But please be as proactive as you can. If you start to see trends, and I would advise your principals and your LEAs in your school district to keep track of attendance with our students with disabilities, so you can be proactive that if you start to see them inching up to 5 days, 10 days, you can start to create a plan, an attendance plan, something to ensure that we can get these students to school. Chandra, there's been a lot of questions around the third grade promotion law and 504s. Do you want to take
I
that?
will, but before getting into those, just kind of going back to the question related to truancy, I'll say this too, and Amanda, this is why I want to just have some more time with this question to share more information. So, knowing as well that there are state statutes that require progressive intervention truancy processes as well to ensure that districts are really tracking these tiers of truancy for students and providing appropriate supports for students as well. So, as I said, if you can send that question to us and we'll really look across those statutes and provide a comprehensive response there. So I see oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, April.
No, I was just going to say, there's several questions around the retention law, and do 504s essentially exempt them from retention?
So with the third grade promotion law, there is language that relates to a student who has a disability or suspected of having a disability that impacts reading. So there could be an instance where a student has a Section 504 plan and they have an identified disability that impacts reading that would allow for that student to meet that exemption requirement there. Remember, you really want to look at these on a case-by-case basis. You really want to ensure that you are making determinations about that particular student and that particular student's needs, and looking at the letter of the law as it relates to third grade promotion, and really making a determination about what is in that student's plan, and is that going to be a disability that would impact reading for that particular student.
Perfect. If a parent requests a meeting with the school psychologist to discuss an IEP for their child, is it appropriate for the school site to suggest a 504 instead of an IEP during their meeting? I'm going to say this first as a school psychologist. None of these decisions should ever be made by one person. w- between 504 and IDA, it should always be a team-based approach, meaning that if the team is going to meet with the parent to hear concerns, the team then is going to make the recommendation for whether we're doing a 504 or an IDA evaluation. It really should not just be the school psychologist who is making that determination. One, because that puts us in a really problematic spot, especially if we are the ones doing the IDA evaluation, but we're saying, no, we're not going to do an IDA evaluation. We're going to do a 504 evaluation. Additionally, if a parent does request an evaluation under IDA procedurally, you must either agree to that evaluation or refuse that evaluation, and you must do that formally through a prior written notice. So all of that should happen within a formal team setting where you have multiple stakeholders providing input as to whether the LEA suspects a disability or they don't. It should not just be one person in your district making this determination. Chandra, anything else around that?
No additional thoughts from me on that one.
In TM Pulse, we are required to record the name of the person who is responsible for the implementation of the 504 plan. Does that have to be the 504 coordinator? Could it be the principal or AP? It absolutely can be any of the above. So typically it would need to either be the building level 504 coordinator or the assistant or principal. I wouldn't have it as anybody else outside of that because they are the ones who've been designated as the responsive parties for responsible parties under 504 at the building level. So absolutely it can be the administrators or the 504 coordinator, and we will defer to your district policies and procedures as who to designate as the responsible party for the implementation of that plan. Just going through a lot of conversation around the retention piece. So I'm just trying to wade through that real quick. Um, Oh, we did not talk about ILPDs and 504s, which I said I would. Thank you for that reminder. So an ILPD, the Individual Learning Plan for Characteristics of Dyslexia, does not in and of itself qualify a child under Section 504 or IDEA. It is an intervention plan. It is a plan that the district has noted, and really it's a funding mechanism for your district. It is an intervention plan that your district has determined that the student has foundational reading skill deficits that need to be remediated. It would be the same under any other RTI intervention plan. So let's say a student had a math deficit and you had an intervention plan. It would be the same as that. It is a general education initiative to address foundational skill deficits in one or more content areas. The ILPD does that just for basic reading and reading fluency skills, right? So in and of itself, having the ILPD does not qualify the student under 504 or IDA unless your team suspects a reading disability that substantially limits them in one or more major life activities, and then you're going to go through your 504 evaluation process. Nothing prevents the child from having a 504 and an ILPD, but the child, if they have an ILPD, and they do qualify under IDA in an area of reading, they can't have both of those. Okay. But you need to do your due diligence. Just having, again, I know we had a lot of concern. Well, just having an ILPD and having the name dyslexia in the title, it does not mean that the child has dyslexia or a specific learning disability. They have foundational reading deficits that are being addressed through general education, instruction, and intervention. And if they fail to respond to that instruction and intervention, now we have suspicion to consider if they qualify under Section 504 or under IDEA. But just having the plan on the front end doesn't automatically do that. Chandra, anything else? I know you guys get a lot of questions around ILPDs.
I think the point that you made about the IOPD not qualifying this or not automatically qualifying the student as a student with a disability is a good point to make. Remember, it is an intervention plan for students who are needing specific supports in that particular area of deficit in reading.
Right. You mentioned that transition from middle to high school is a change of placement and may be a reason for a reevaluation. How do you do this within a reasonable time frame when no one in the building has knowledge or experience of the child yet? What are your thoughts? So the reevaluation should actually, how the language is written, should be done prior to the significant change of placement. So what we would encourage you, I know this is not always feasible, but what we would encourage you to do is to try to pull in stakeholders from the place that they're transitioning to. So if it is from middle to high school, try to pull in the high school 504 coordinator, maybe one or more high school teachers if necessary to understand the landscape. Remember, 504 plans are about access. And so the big reason why I think, and this is my thoughts only, why they have made this requirement is there's going to be a big difference in the level of access between a middle school and a high school. We need to address those to ensure that when the child does transition to that new setting, they have what they need to be successful and to access their environment. So, for a student who maybe has an orthopedic type impairment where they're going to have to access multiple floors of the high school, maybe they're going to need to know how to access the elevator or who to go request a key to a special bathroom because they need additional space, right? We need to make sure that that plan is in place prior to getting to that new setting. And that's why we would suggest having some type of transition meeting with that incoming school. It's not always possible, but certainly you should do your due diligence to attempt to make that happen. Chandra, anything else there?
No, I think that really nails it, about really thinking about what may be the changes in that education setting when the student is moving from the middle school to the high school and ensuring that they are able to access that new setting.
If students are suspected of having a disability and the S team has already taken place, can the student be suspended before the testing has taken place? So, yes, technically, yes, depending on how many days they've already been suspended or expelled. So, we say within 504 and under IDA, you have 10 FAPE free days, meaning that you have 10 days of suspension expulsion prior to the need of holding an MDR. So, if they're being suspended for 3 days, you're in the middle of your evaluation process, they absolutely can be suspended 3 days. And then you're going to, when you come back, finish your evaluation process. So if they've already exceeded that 10 days, you're going to need to finish that evaluation as quickly as you can, because if they don't qualify, then they're not entitled to the procedural protections of a manifestation determination. So we would encourage you that if you do have students who are showing some marked behavioral issues, to make sure you're prioritizing those evaluations to get them done in a timely manner. Chandra, chime
And
in there.
yeah, I'll add here. I think that this question usually comes to us in the form of maybe parents who are requesting a 504 evaluation when a student is, when some kind of disciplinary action is being considered for a student, particularly some kind of expulsion or alternative school placement. If that is the case, be sure that you're conducting your evaluation process as quickly as possible so that you can come to an appropriate conclusion about whether or not the student qualifies for a Section 504 plan, and you can make those determinations about whether or not the manifestation determination review is needed to conclude whether or not the disability is what led to the conduct or what led to the conduct of the student there.
I see some questions. Do we call it learning disability, dyslexia, or characteristics of? So dyslexia is a specific learning disability. That is how it's defined across literature. That's how it's defined in the clinical setting. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability. And so, but you're certainly able to say dyslexia. You're certainly able to call that out as a disabling condition on your 504 plan, but just making sure that we're all aware that dyslexia, even if you carve it out as a separate name, is under the umbrella of a specific learning disability. I see another question. Can you please talk about when a student can't have a 504 and an ILPD? Students can have an ILPD and a 504. Students cannot necessarily have an IEP and an ILPD if the IEP is addressing areas of reading, if they're receiving reading services. And I think, Chandra, you probably know the citation better than I. If they have a diagnosis or eligibility under SLD basic reading or reading fluency, I don't believe that they can have an ILPD, but please check state law on that. But 504 and ILPD, I don't believe there are any necessarily restrictions there. Chandrea, any restrictions around having a 504 and an ILPD?
I do not believe so. I definitely want to check the state board rule on there because I think that's the place that you're referring to, April, and regulations that would speak to that particular topic.
I see a lot of requests for us to draft out an FAQ document with some of these questions. We will absolutely consider that. I appreciate your thoughts there. I think I missed a few. Let me go back. I know if Courtney or Jocelyn are on the call too, I know you guys are probably looking at questions.
And I'll just say this too about the request for an FAQ, and it may address some of the questions that are here, but there may be a need for us to provide more guidance on different topics as well. I think may have seen a question about this as well. Our updated Section 504 manual is now available online. It is on the legal services page. We're going to actually add the link to the document in the chat. That document is just being put out there today. I see Courtney just added it to the chat, but the Section 504 manual has been updated and is now available online. It does include a section of FAQs that may address some of the questions that folks have posed today.
Perfect. I have received a new student with a 504 plan from another school district for having characteristics of dyslexia. I cannot determine if the student had an ILPD first before the student received a 504 plan. Could this student have a 504 plan? We do not have a medical diagnosis. Should we hold a meeting? So first, if you have a student who is coming into your district with a 504 plan, we're going to honor that 504 plan. And if you have a need to reevaluate to determine eligibility, you can reevaluate. You do not need a medical diagnosis. Actually, dyslexia is not a medical diagnosis. So it is a psychological diagnosis, perhaps. And they are not required to have an ILPD before a Section 504 plan for dyslexia. They may have an ILPD, but they also may not have an ILPD and still would qualify under Section 504 for dyslexia. So again, that's why we always need to take these on a case-by-case basis. And if you need or you determine that additional information is necessary to substantiate their eligibility, you can request to conduct a reevaluation for this student. But I would just be cautious to say that they don't qualify because they did not have an ILPD. I'm not quite sure the question. It just says, can you speak to medically fragile? I know that Chandrea had mentioned some stuff around medically fragile, but if you could clarify what specifically you need us to talk about there, let us know. I don't think I see anything else that we haven't already addressed. I do see a question to me privately around read aloud and percentiles. I'm just going to address this with the group because I have to admit that I get this question a lot, and I would prefer just to kind of get it out there. We cannot require specific percentiles or cut scores for a student to qualify for any given accommodation. So I know we have a lot of districts that are saying students must have this percentile on this measure to qualify for read aloud. I would always caution against that practice. All of our decisions around accommodation should be made with current and valid data, but we should very much not be using specific cut scores or percentiles, because a student may need and require read aloud to receive FAPE, and they may be performing way above what that percentile shows that you're requiring. Always on a case-by-case basis, collect the data that you need to substantiate if it will provide that education comparable to non-disabled peers. Be very cautious about using cut scores and collect whatever data that you need to substantiate that inclusion or refusal. Somebody asked if there's a dedicated 504 page on our website that compiles all the documents we need to be a 504 coordinator.
So I'll say we do have a dedicated Section 504 page that speaks about many of the legal requirements and houses some of the guidance documents and materials or external links to guidance materials from the U.S. Department of Education. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're specific to serving as a Section 504 coordinator, whether that be building-based coordinator or district level coordinator, but some resources there. And it looks like Jocelyn just posted that link to that webpage in the chat.
Perfect. I work as a teacher at a residential treatment facility. Students receive their education within that facility, assuming this would warrant a reevaluation due to a change in placement for all students we get with 504s, potentially, possibly. So just consider that on a case-by-case basis. If necessary, consult your board attorney to determine if the transition from their school of zone to the residential facility would constitute that. And then I would consider it, especially ensuring that they are receiving the appropriate supports within the context of what your facility looks like. And I guess that brings up, well, Chandra, what are your thoughts on that within a residential
I'd actually like
facility?
that question shared with us after today's training.
Okay.
My team provides support to the non-traditional education programs as well, so we can definitely consult with that team to get some additional information that could be shared on that particular question.
Um, let's see, they dropped that page. Can you clarify what we should do or be looking for if a preschool student is asking for a 504 and what that looks like for accessing the academics? I think I understand that question. I think if the preschool student is being served in a federally funded or that a facility that receives federal funding, so think of like our voluntary preschool programs, then you do need to consider if a 504 evaluation is appropriate for those students if necessary. But when we think about accessing, it's not just academics. We're thinking about accessing the environment, accessing um, really any level of access. So when we think about those major life activities, the impact that could be caring for oneself, it could be something related to adaptive skills and toileting. It could be communication. It could be a lot of other things where we have to consider if the child would have a disability that would impact a major life activity. I would also state in a lot of my consultation with districts on getting referrals for preschool students, I often do recommend that they start with an IDA evaluation for those preschool students because one, it provides more comprehensive information addressing all developmental domains for the preschool students. And if they don't qualify through that evaluation process, then certainly your teams can consider a 504, but I would just again be cautious. We're not just talking about academics. I know a lot of questions we get, and this should be on our FAQ, is the student is passing all of their classes, they're getting all A's. Can they still qualify under Section 504? Yes, because we're not just talking about academics, we're talking about all the other pieces that are contributing to their ability to access that environment and instruction. For example, had a student who was in all honors classes, and she had a 504 for dyslexia. Had a student who was passing all of her classes and had a 504 for diabetes. Just grades alone should not be the contributing factor to determine if a child should be evaluated or subsequently does or does not qualify.
I think I'm seeing three remaining questions in the chat, April. We maybe haven't addressed.
Should an evaluation, oh, that was sent to me privately. I will address that privately then. What would you encourage we use in our evaluation process to determine if read aloud accommodation is appropriate? I think I alluded to this before, but I think you could set up structures to ask your teachers to assist you in providing you some information, having them go through different like simulations with their students to have them read independently. And how do they do answering questions after they read independently versus when they're read aloud? You can loop in your school psych and have them do some type of working memory, listening comprehension assessments. You really need to ensure that the student has the skills to be able to listen effectively, understand, and kind of manipulate the information that they're hearing in order to then answer the questions effectively or do whatever the task is. So I think you just need to set up some structures to say, how does the student do when he or she is read aloud versus when they don't? And have a lot of, and not just one time, I would do it multiple times across different content areas to know how the student does and do they perform comparably to non-disabled peers. Chandrea, somebody asked about if you have an example of 504 grievance procedures or if another district has one, if they would be willing to share.
And I will say there are some model Section 504 grievance procedures out there that can be shared. But I also want to encourage you to consult with your board attorney on development of your particular district's grievance procedures to ensure that any particular practices or processes are identified and noted in those procedures and are covered, and ensuring too that folks are trained on those procedures as well, and have a good understanding of how to implement the procedures in place.
I see something about our contact information. I think that's on our last slide here. We'll share our contact information. And then I see one other question around, we have an issue where an IEP needs to be reevaluated to give student services. The meeting is past due. The teacher keeps requesting and it's still not been addressed. Erica, we can't speak to that specific situation here, but you need to loop in your building level principal and then potentially your special education director if the IEP itself has gone out of compliance and the team has not been able to get that back into compliance. Loop in your necessary leadership to inform them and let them know of what's happening. Jamie, I see the comment question around, are there any plans or future training opportunities focused on the evaluation process and using evaluation tools? We certainly can consider that. We have not done a training of that type before, but we can chat internally. And if we feel like that's something that we need to offer, then we will do that. And we will send out, I know Chandra and her team have a list of 504 coordinators. I have a listserv of people who are kind of overseeing 504s in the state. So we will send that out and then you can disseminate it as you need to. But we'll talk about if that's something that we can start to work on developing.
And there's a guidance document, I think it's a 2-pager on the 504 evaluation process that we can share with this group as well.
Oh, absolutely. I forgot about that. We can certainly share that. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Chandra, do you mind flipping to the last
I think
slide?
Courtney added it to the chat. Look,
Oh, did you?
our support is really
Oh,
quick
you're
today.
so good. Yes, check out that 504 evaluations document. That may help assist with some of those questions.
And April, I think that's all I'm seeing in the chat. Just want to thank everyone for joining, for being active participants in today's training as well. We really appreciate the questions, you guys, and being so engaged in today's training. Also, the engagement with the scenarios as well. This, as I said before, this is our second time hosting this training. Our plan is to continue to host these on an annual basis. And we are excited to have shared that new updated Section 504 manual with you all today. Please reach out if you have any questions. Our contact information is here. You'll get a copy of this slide. You'll also get a link to the video recording once it's available as well. Please reach out with any questions. We are happy to provide guidance and support. And if it's a question that we can't answer, or if we need to direct you back to folks in your district, we'll definitely be sure to note who in your district might be able to provide additional guidance or specific support on those particular topics.
Perfect. And I will say, I don't know if Courtney can unmute. I know that we are offering tassel credit. Please give us some time to get those certificates together and to be sent over to you. There's a substantial amount of people that attended today, and it will take us time to get those certificates over. So be patient with us, please. I know Courtney just dropped the link into the chat again if you needed the Tassel credit link. But again, just be patient. So if you don't hear from us in the next few weeks, know that we will be emailing you with all of the stuff that we agreed to provide you. Just give us a little bit of time.
All right. And with that, you guys, we're going to end our call. Again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.